Hello, and welcome to the Nauticast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through a Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brenda B. Fish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 104th episode of the Nauticast titled The Last Samurai, an analysis of A Clash of Kings, Jon 4 and 5, in which the Night's Watch arrives at the Fist of the First Men, and Jon acquires yet another father figure, Qhorin Halfhand, who is a supreme badass. Oh my god, I'm so happy that we're here to be Qhorin Halfhand.
And thanks to his dog, Jon finds a very ordinary bundle whose contents aren't important at all and whose origin will in no way inspire a furious screaming match between us that will burn the Nauticast down. No, sir. None of that will be happening, I promise you.
Yes, we regret to announce this is the last episode of the Nauticast podcast that you will ever actually see. So, yeah, it's we've done 104 episodes. We feel like we made it significantly to A Clash of Kings, but no, we're going to have a nice little discussion at the end of this episode to talk about who actually dropped off that bundle of Dragon Glass and different things that are in there. So, as always, this episode is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Tim Bob, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard Mark N, Lord Travis, Master of Ships and Ward of the Waves, Sir Keith J, Master of Whispers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Red Woman, and Mistress of Whispers, Lord Micah, Ward of the West, the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the Gem that was promised, the High Bearded Priest, Lord Jake Assistant 2, the Hand of the King, Lady Xena Valyrian, Hedrigal, Captain of the Airship Arrogance, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., Sir Jasper the Cruel, the King's Justice, Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, Ward of the Eastern Mistress of Old Bay of Crabs, Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Anonymous, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, the Priest of the Drowned God, the King's Cook, Noli Oli, Master of Cannoli, Sir Sorcidelica, Prince Matthew of House Targaryen, Proud Soyboy of Summerhall, Defender of the Fifth Book, and Swing Dancer with Dragons, Sir K.W. Dent, Elsie of the Blackwood Guard, and Batman of the Seven Kingdoms, Lord Penchant for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, Rainbow Commander of the Ladies and Gentle Dems, Lord Quint Esquire, Master of absolutely positively not serving as a spy for several unnamed high lords and ladies in order to further the secret Blackfire style conspiracy to overthrow the oppressive small council. However, the waiter for T-Wow. 1 second, I lost my place. A. Ron, Damper, Prophet of the Forsaken, and High Priest of Euron Crowseye, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Veneras of House Colgarian, the First of her name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mistress of Art, the Overworked Queen of Pencils, the Eraser in the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee of the Great Game of Thrones, Portraitess of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, Blender Paints, and Maker of Drawings, Seanwell the Slayer, Lord Adam T, Lady Alexandra of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logus, Bloody Scorpion of the Red Field, Defender of the Letter of Kin, and Wolverine of House Corgoyle, Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse-Faced Lesbians, and our 2 newest members of the Small Council. That's right. You heard that right. 2 newest members of the Small Council. Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, and Sir Vayor, Chief of Parties and the Frozen Wastes. Thank you, Council, very much, and welcome to our new Small Council members.
Thank you to all our counselors, as always, and welcome to Sir Josh and Sir Vayor. Good to know that the North will have bounty hunters and parties. Sounds like a fun time up in the North from now on. That's good to know.
Yes, so much fun. Yeah. Our spoiler warnings, we say in all episodes, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan novellas, histories, interviews, the Winds of Winter sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Guilty Undertaker, a Sworn Sword patron, who asks, on the subject of theories, do you still think that Dany, Jon, and Tyrion will fly beyond the curtain on Dragonback for a final showdown with whatever's there in order to defeat the others? I am more skeptical after Season 8. And yeah, the Heart of Winter is obviously the icy equivalent to Ashai. That's the fire equivalent. And just like Ashai, as it was hinted at and maybe part of the game for Dany early on, but ultimately we won't be going there in the series, and we might see it through Melisandre's eyes, judging from what George has said. The Heart of Winter feels like it might be that way to me now. Like maybe we won't go there directly, but through Bran's chapters, we'll get a better look at it. What do you think?
As always, George has said that we will go farther north than we've ever gone before in the Winds of Winter. We've said that a couple times in the Nauticast podcast now. I do think that this is extremely unlikely that we're going to have some sort of major battle occurring in the far north in the Heart of Winter. And I want to talk to you guys, direct your attention to a passage in Fire and Blood where George R. R. Martin is writing this in 2017 or 2018, one of the two, probably early 2018, if we're being honest. And the passage goes something to the effect of Queen Alicent takes her dragon, tries to fly north of the wall, cannot get north of the wall, and she writes a letter back to her husband stating that she tried as best as she possibly could to get that dragon to go north, but it did not want to cross the wall. which to me indicates that there is some sort of magical ward that prevents dragons and other mystical magical beings from crossing the wall. Something that we find with the character of Cold Hands, who cannot cross south of the wall because it is warded, as he states in A Storm of Swords and also in A Dance of Dragons, I believe. So yes, I am with you there. I don't think we're going to be seeing a final showdown on Dragonback at the Heart of Winter. I think more likely George may have kind of like, fudged a little bit, and now with Dany's dream happening in A Storm of Swords, it's possible we could see the final confrontation taking place at the Trident, or it could be at Winterfell as was portrayed in the show. I'm fine with either of those possibilities. I tend to lean towards Winterfell just because, well, one form of canon has it occurring at Winterfell, and that's enough for me to think that the name itself and the show canon helps to indicate that the final confrontation will take place at Winterfell, although I'd be unhappy if it took place at the Trident.
Very well said, sir. Across the board. Definitely agreed. So thank you, Guilty Undertaker, for the question. If you'd like to ask us questions that we'll answer here on the Nauticast podcast, you're welcome to become a Sword, or higher level patron over at patreon.com/Nauticast, ASOIAF, where you can also get 25 bonus episodes, 6 Fever Dream episodes, show notes, access to our exclusive Slack, and more.
And if you guys are patrons, and you guys should know this, you've been paying attention to social media today, our voting for our next Patreon-only episode is in full swing. So if you listen or watch this episode before Friday at noon and you're a patron, come vote over at patreon.com/Nauticast, ASOIF, to choose our next Patreon-only episode that we will be forced to do at gunpoint because we are believers in democracy. We will abide by the will of the people in choosing our episode subject for this month. But enough about Patreon for now. Let's turn our attention to Jon Snow. When we last checked in with Jon, he had a lovely time at Craster's remote ski lodge, but sadly, he had to get back to hiking with the boys to go meet up with some friends in the mountains. Let's see what happens to Jon in this analysis of A Clash of Kings, Jon 4 and 5. The Night's Watch arrives within sight of a hill, and boy, is this hill going to be important for the narrative going forward. The wildlings called it the Fist of the First Men, Rangers said. Did look like a fist, Jon thought, punching up through the earth and wood, its bare brown slopes knuckled with stone. Jon's at the front of the column of Rangers with the high officers and with the good LC, but Ghost wasn't about being tied down. He runs off twice with Jon whistling him back reluctantly. When he ran off a third time, Mormont tells Jon just to, let him go, can't hold that wolf back anymore. Where was I? Oh, yeah. The Night's Watch climbs the steep, stony summit with Jon noticing a chest-high wall of rocks. They then circle the hill until they find a wide enough gap to let the horses in. Mormont thinks this is good ground to be on while they wait for Qhorin Halfhand. The LC then climbs down and Jon takes in the view. The views atop the hill were bracing. Yet it was the ring wall that drew Jon's eye. The weathered gray stones with their white patches of lichen, their beards of gray moss. It was said that the Fist had been a ring fort of the first men of the Dawn Age. An old place and strong, Thorin Smallwood said. Bloodraven, Mormont's Raven, starts being a dick and screams, "Ode, ode, ode," at Mormont, which, Mr. Bloodraven, I should really point out to you that you're no spring chicken either. Gior tells the bird to shut up, but Jon notices that Mormont is looking a bit old and tired. This whole march was taking its toll on the good LC. Thorin says that this place is easily defendable, but Jon points out that it's kind of a long climb to get water from the stream below. Thorin then mocks Jon for being weak or some shit because Thorin's just a fucking dick in this chapter. So Mormont says they'll haul water up the hill, and Jon shuts up and notices all the black tents going up on the hill. Mormont then orders the wall defenses improved and Jon to get to work on the LC's tent. After putting up the tent, Jon heads down the hill to try and find Ghost, and the direwolf suddenly shows up all silent-like. Jon tries to direct Ghost back up the hill, but the direwolf balks at the ring wall. Jon tries then dragging Ghost through the wall, but he was too strong. He asks what's wrong with Ghost before letting the direwolf go and, quote, "Hun, they ought to be safe here." The hill offered commanding views, and the slopes were precipitous to the north and west, and only slightly more gentle to the east. Yet, as the dusk deepened and the darkness seeped into the hollows between the trees, Jon's sense of foreboding grew. This is the haunted forest, he told himself. Maybe there are ghosts here. The spirits of the first men. This was their place once. Jon goes for a look around, feeling safe at the height, but scared at the haunted forest around the hill. Then he snaps back and says there's no such thing as ghosts, and then, Byronic hero that he is, watches the sun set while he broods. Then Jon climbs onto the highest rocks, and we're onto a long description of scenery, which is really, it's terrific stuff, but I'll skip most of it to save on for time because we're still in the first of 2 chapters here. But I do love this scene, which I will depict here. When the wind blew, he could hear the creak and groan of branches older than he was. 1,000 leaves fluttered, and for a moment, the forest seemed a deep green sea, storm-tossed and heaving, eternal and unknowable. Just Lovely stuff. That's just good writing on George's part. But then Samuel arrives below and calls out to him. How's Jon doing? Fine, Sam. How are you? Sam is doing really well. Actually, no shit. No shit. And anyways, they're all going to be sticking here at the Fist of the First Men for a little while until Qhorin arrives. By the way, think any battles were fought here? Sam asks. Definitely, Jon replies. Jon then tells Sam he should send a raven back to Castle Black, and Sam says he wishes he could be a raven. Jon smiles at that, and they go walk about the camp as the stars come out overhead before Jon excuses himself to go see Mormont. Arriving back at Mormont's tent, Jon gets immediately told to bring some hot wine for the boys, aka the High Command of the Night's Watch. So Jon, acting like a bit like a fraternity pledge, gets to work heating the wine up in a kettle, making sure not to boil it while he drops some eaves on the High Command, debating their next steps. And I'm just going to bullet point this for brevity's sake. We'll cover this more in the depth portion. Malderlock wants to advance up the giant stair or the Skirling Pass to take the wildlings unawares. Otten Withers thinks it's a stupid fucking idea. Mormont doesn't want to go that way unless he absolutely has to. He wants to stay put at the Fist of the First Men. Thorin Smallwood wants to go a-ranging, but Mormont orders him to stay south of the river. Thorin doesn't like this. Strategy session complete. Jon enters the tent and asks if Mormont wants his dinner. He would, but hey, did Ghost return and bring some fresh meat? Nope, sorry, meat's not back on the menu tonight. Mormont then asks what Jon thinks of his plan, and Jon tries to dodge as he's only here to serve the Lord Commander, but Mormont presses him. So Jon says he's not sure why the LC is keeping the Rangers close instead of searching for Benjen Stark. Well, you see, if Benjen is alive, he's going to follow the trail that the Night's Watch left for him. Yes, said Jon, but what if he's dead? Mormont asked, not unkindly. Jon nodded reluctantly. Dead, the Raven said. Dead, dead. He may come to us anyway, the old bear said, as Arthur did, and Jafer Flowers. I dread that as much as you, Jon, but we must admit that it's a possibility. Mormont then says he's not hungry after all and dismisses Jon to get some rest. So Jon gathers his things up and realizes that he's hungry. He heads over to a fire and finds Dolores, Ed, Grand, and Hake gathered around the fire, listening to Dywin talk about his fear of the woods and how he wouldn't want to be out ranging in the haunted forest tonight. You see, Dywin can smell the, quote, cold out in the forest. And while the others mock Dywin, saying there's no smell like cold, Jon disagrees. There is a smell like cold, thought Jon. Remember the night in the Lord Commander's chambers. It smells like death. Suddenly, Jon wasn't hungry anymore. Jon heads out into the night with the cold winds rising. He takes the leftover of wine to a fire, reheats, and starts flexing his fingers, and then he hears the howling of wolves. And then Jon sees red eyes staring at him from across the fire. Don't worry, it's Ghost, guys. I know you were really worried there. Ghost sniffs around the fire with the manic energy that leads Jon to believe that Ghost isn't hungry. And right there, Jon starts to get really worried about the possibility he's in a similar situation as he was back in a Game of Thrones, with Arthur creeping up the stairs to Mormont's chambers. Ghost starts off and Jon gives chase to the direwolf. Jon encounters a man standing by a fire on watch, which you guys never like, oh my God, you guys are this is the worst watchman in the entire Night's Watch. I swear to God. Jon tells the man that he's going to get water for the LC, and the watcher, literally a man with rocks for brains, like, yeah, sure, whatever. Are you actually a Night's Watchman? I don't care. I'm just going to stand here by the fire. And then Jon goes to get water. So Jon follows Ghost down the hill, catching glimpses of him, losing him, catching sight of him, chasing. There's a lot of this Jon chases Ghost, and I'm skipping over again because we're doing 2 chapters this week, and we're not even to the second chapter yet, until Jon sees Ghost digging in the ground beside a fallen tree. So he goes to investigate. The soil was loose, sandy. Jon pulled it out by the fistful. There were no stones, no roots. Whatever was here had been put here recently. 2 feet down, his fingers touched cloth. He had been expecting a corpse. Fearing a corpse, but this was something else. He pushed against the fabric and felt small, hard shapes beneath, unyielding. There was no smell, no sign of grave worms. Ghost backed off and sat on his haunches, watching. Jon digs into the earth and retrieves the cloth bundle from the ground. He pulls out his dagger and cuts into it, and knives, arrowheads, and spearheads fall out. Jon picks up a handful and finds razor-sharp black daggers. Dragon glass. Jon wonders whether Ghost had dug up buried treasure from the First Men, but then Jon notices something else under the dragon glass. Beneath the dragon glass was an old war horn, made from oryx horn and banded in bronze. Jon shook the dirt from inside it, and a stream of arrowheads fell out. He let them fall and pulled up a corner of the cloth the weapons had been wrapped in, rubbing it between his fingers. Good wool, thick, a double weave, damp but not rotted. It could not have been long in the ground, and it was dark. He seized a handful and pulled it close to the torch. Not dark, black. Even before Jon stood and shook it out, he knew what he had, the black cloak of a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. A few weeks later, a horn is blowing, and Jon is reaching for Longclaw, wondering if another blast of the horn is coming. Jon feels as if the whole hill is holding its breath for that blast, but it never comes. Everyone grins at each other. For now, we're not that far away from the... we'll see. And Mormont emerges from his tent, asking if it was only one blast. Yes, sir, one blast. Brothers returning. Mormont says it's the Halfhand, and he wants to go see him immediately, and Jon agrees, thinking that the men from the Shower Tower should have arrived days ago. Jon thinks back to everyone wondering about whether Qhorin would show up and what they should do. Again, we're going to go with bullet points here. Sir Otton Withers wants to retreat back to Castle Black. Sir Mallitor Locke wanted to move towards the Shadow Tower and pick up Qhorin's trail. Thor and Smallwood wanted to push into the mountains and go against Mance, mounted and his wolves among sheep. Otton thinks this is a dumb fucking plan and they would be outnumbered and get destroyed by Mance. Long story short, everyone disagrees and no decisions are made. But now that Qhorin was here, things were better. Now they can make a decision and come to battle soon. Jon heads down a hill and gives Dolorous Ed something to complain about. He encounters Samo, and Sam asks if the blast meant that Benjen returned. Sadly, no. It's only men from the Shadow Tower, Jon said. It was growing harder to cling to the hope of Benjen Stark's safe return. The cloak he had found beneath the fist could well have belonged to his uncle or one of his men. Even the old bear admitted as much, though why they would have buried it there, wrapped around a cache of dragon glass, no one could say. Jon bids Sam adieu and heads down to the ring wall. He finds men moving the spikes aside to let Qhorin's men through, and then he sees riders come through all in leather and armor and fur with heavy beards. And a lot of them were wounded. Not good. Not good at all. But then some good news rides through the opening. And look, I've been summarizing a lot of things in this chapter, but full fucking paragraph here because Qhorin Halfhand deserves this. Jon knew Qhorin Halfhand the instant he saw him, though they had never met. The big ranger was half a legend in the Watch, a man of slow words and swift action, tall and straight as a spear, long-limbed and solemn. Unlike his men, he was clean-shaven. His hair fell from beneath his helm, and heavy braid touched with hoarfrost, and the blacks he wore so faded that they might have been grays. Only thumb and forefinger remained on the hand that held the reins. The other fingers had been sheared off, catching a wildling's axe that would have otherwise split his skull. It was told that he had thrust his maimed fist into the face of the axeman, so the blood spurted into his eyes and slew him while he was blind. Since that day, the wildlings beyond the wall had known no foe more implacable. Guys, I don't know about you, but my loins are stirring. I can't help it. So moist. Jon tells Qhorin that Mormont wants to see him, and Qhorin says his boys are hungry. Get him fed. Also, Jon, you look like your dad, Ned. Jon asks if Qhorin knew Ned, and yes, Qhorin did, as well as Lord Rickard Stark. Qhorin asks if the rumors about Jon having a daughter were true, and yes, the true rumors are indeed true. They make their way up the hill and find Dolorous Ed making breakfast and Mormont in his camp chair. Mormont asks what took them so long, and Qhorin says that they ran into trouble. Alfin Crowkiller scouting the wall. They fought Alfin, and Alfin is killed, but they lost 4 of their own with another dozen wounded. Oh, and they also tortured one of the surviving wildlings and got some valuable intel, but they should talk about it inside Mormont's tent. So Qhorin and Mormont go into the tent and leave Jon to hang out with Dolorous Ed. The steward then begins gloomily talking. Another top five quote by Dolorous Ed here. Ed stood over his kettle, swishing the eggs about with a spoon. I envy those eggs, he said. I could do with a bit of boiling now. If the kettle were larger, I might jump in. Though I would sooner were wine than water. There are worse things to die than warm and drunk. I knew a brother drowned himself in wine once. It was a poor vintage, though, and his corpse did not improve it. You drank the wine? Jon asked. It's an awful thing to find a brother dead. You'd have need of a drink as well, Lord Snow. Love it. Oh, God. Ed is the best. Jon starts poking the fire with a stick, wondering over why Qhorin Halfhand seems so gloomy. They killed Alfin Crowkiller. Seems kind of like a victory, right? Yeah, it should seem like that way. Then Jon remembers wandering around the camp and the night before and overhearing Lark the Sisterman and Chet bitching about being up here on the Fist of the First Men and how they would all die. And maybe they're not going to listen to any orders sending them up the Frostfangs. But then one of Chet's hounds growled and Jon beats feet so as not to be found out, knowing that he wasn't meant to hear any of them. He's also not going to tell Mormont about Chet and Lark because he's not a snitch. Besides, it's just empty talk, right? No, wrong. Anyways, Jon has now armed himself with one of the dragon glass daggers. He slips it out and studies it, thinking that it was buried there for a reason. So Jon had made daggers for Gren Jon had made daggers for Gren and one for the LC. Oh, and Jon had taken the war horn and given it a little toot because when you have a potentially magical horn, you just give it a little blow, right, guys? Like, oh my God, like, Christ, you didn't bring the fucking wall down, Jon. Oh, my God, are you like the Azora High figure? We'll talk about that. Anyways, breakfast is done, and Ed asks whether he or Jon should bring the breakfast in, and Jon says he wants to do it. So he enters and overhears Qhorin talking about Rattleshirt, the Weeper, and all the wildling chiefs, wargs, mammoths, and every wildling. Though Jon doesn't hear the context, Mormont says that the wall must be warned and that the king should hear the news too. Qhorin bites into an egg and states that the best hope lies with the Starks. Mormont agrees and then grabs up a few maps. Jon deciphers that Mormont is attempting to determine where the wildlings will strike, and that's pretty important as only 3 of the 17 castles on the wall are presently manned. Mormont idealistically puts in that Alistair Thorne will bring back more men for the wall and man Greyguard and Longbarrow, which, extremely optimistic thinking on Mormont's part, I know. The 2 men talk about roving patrols, manning other castles, then they talk about whether they should strike with their cavalry force. And then the discussion turns to how do they get through the wall. They'll probably go through one of the gates or use the ropes to climb the walls, says Mormont. A breach, Qhorin said. Mormont's head came up sharply. What? They do not plan to climb the wall nor burrow beneath it, my lord. They plan to break it. The wall is 700 feet high and so thick at the base that it would take 100 men a year to cut through it with picks and axes. Even so, Mormont plucked at his beard, frowning. How? How else? Sorcery. Besides, why else would Mance head up to the Frostfangs? They were looking for something, some sort of sorcerous implement to bring down the wall. There was no other reason they would go up into the mountains. That's what their tortured captives said anyways. They were looking for some power. But what? As for that, Qhorin proposes that they scout out the wildlings and find out what's going on with them, but Mormont is loath to risk more men to die up in the mountains on a dangerous ranging. We can only die. Why else would we don these black cloaks but to die in defense of the realm? I would send 15 men in 3 parties of 5, 1 to pump the milk water, 1 the Skirling Pass, 1 to climb the giant stair, Jarman Buckwell, Thorin Smallwood, and myself to command, to learn what waits in those mountains. Mormont relents and sees no other choice. But what if they don't come back? Well, someone will come down from the Frostfangs. Whether it's the Rangers or Mance Raider, Mormont's Rangers are well positioned to intercept Mance. Besides, the Fist is a strong spot to hold out against. Not that strong, said Mormont. Be like we all die then. Our dying will buy us time for our brothers on the wall. Time to garrison the empty castles and freeze shut the gates. Time to summon lords and kings to their aid. Time to hone their axes and repair their catapults. Our lives will be coin well spent, Qhorin says. God, you just love the way that Qhorin talks in these chapters. It's so, so good. Bloodraven starts screaming the lyrics to the Avid Brothers' Die, 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 Die song, but Mormont ignores the Raven and asks Qhorin to choose his men for the ranging. Qhorin Halfhand turned his head. His eyes met Jon's and held them for a long moment. Very well. I choose Jon Snow. Mormont starts to protest that Dolorous Ed was a better pick, but Qhorin doesn't want Ed. He wants Jon, who follows the old gods. The gods were strong beyond the wall, so Mormont turns to Jon and asks what Jon wants to do. To go, he said at once. The old man smiled sadly. I thought it might be. Dawn had broken when Jon stepped from the tent beside Qhorin Halfhand. The wind swirled around them, stirring their black cloaks and sending a scatter of red cinders flying from the fire. We ride at noon, the ranger told him. Be best find that wolf of yours. And that is Clash of Kings, Jon 4 and 5. Lots of setup, lots of build-up, and boy, am I now ready to get to Jon's adventures in the mountains here to Clash of Kings. One of my favorite parts of just all the Song of Ice and Fire. But what did you think of this chapter? Ebbet?
So, as we've said, Jon's storyline in A Clash of Kings really ramps up in excitement and overall quality once he gets into the Frostfangs with Qhorin Halfhand and his crew. And we're not quite there yet. Jon 4 and 5 taken together speak to both the weaknesses and strengths of Jon's chapters in this book. On the one hand, it is starting to become clear that the Night's Watch is going to spend this whole book on the trail of interesting things, and that the interesting things themselves won't show up until the next book. There's more atmosphere here than plot progression or character development. That said, there's nothing wrong with lingering in an atmosphere if it's well done, and the atmosphere on the Fist of the First Men is wonderfully spooky. On reread, I realized what a perfect backdrop this is for our introduction to Qhorin Halfhand, because like the Fist, he is a source of reassuring strength, but also kind of scary.
Yeah, he is kind of scary, but he's also like that kind of guy who shows up and takes charge of things and hopefully directs the watch in the right direction, right? We'll see. As we know, though, George is also weaving multiple genres into A Song of Ice and Fire. Noir detective, fantasy, action, mafia, horror, but not sci-fi. George has been very explicit about that. It's not sci-fi, guys. The genre I see the genre I see in Jon's Clash storyline is very much action-adventure with dashes of mystery and fantasy tossed into too. And I really appreciate on reread. I mean, especially after Arya 7 and Sansa 3, the way we did for this chapter order. And it's not that I found the last 2 episodes and last 2 chapters we covered a slog. Far from it. They are really vital in understanding the themes that George communicates in the story and how so many characters in A Song of Ice and Fire fall short. It's just that they're really heavy chapters, man. I mean, my emotions range from sad to sickened to outraged to angry, and that was a lot. Getting into these 2 Jon chapters is a real nice reprieve from all that. And I mean, I skipped over a lot of it in my synopsis, but all the scenery, it's kind of Lord of the Rings-esque. I mean, I feel like I'm on a grand adventure with Jon and his friends to save Benjen Stark. No, it's to find and defeat the others. No, it's actually to defeat Mance Rayder. Oh, wait. Okay, fine. I think we can settle on this. We're going to set up shop at the Fist of the First Men.
That's what we're here to do. And up until this point, we have been on the trail of Waymar, Royce, and company from the prologue to A Game of Thrones. But now, we are officially further north than we've ever been before. And that's both exciting and frightening for the reader. And Jon shares the same spirit. It's the wonder of discovery, slowly sapped away by a sense of dread. And I think this really comes through when you compare how the Fist is written relative to White Tree and Craster's Keep from the previous Jon chapters. On the one hand, our initial impression of the Fist is one of strength. The name alone sounds strong. A giant fist of stone, an ancient fortress. We'll be safe here. The senior officers of the Night's Watch are reassured by the defensive position offered by the hill, so much so that you can see all their plans reforming around it. L.C. Mormont immediately declares it good ground and says that they will await Qhorin Halfhand and his Shadow Tower men here. Sensible enough so far. But the Old Guard's dedication to their conventional wisdom ends up contributing to the mission creep we'll discuss later on. Right away, Thorin Smallwood's snotty attitude toward Jon is a tip-off that the leadership is mismanaging things. Jon's not lazy, you sanctimonious prick. He's raising a very legitimate concern, the lack of easy access to water. Now, Mormont does address his concerns in a somewhat more substantive way, but it is still a bad sign about the mindset pervasive in Watch leadership, and Jon feels more silenced than actually reassured. Because what Jon is getting at is a larger issue than water. What he's getting at is the same issue he got at in Craster's Keep. It's whether the Fist as a whole is actually as reliable a defensive position as it seems. After all, it's abandoned, just like White Tree and the other villages. If it's so strong a fortress, why isn't anyone here? Even if Mance doesn't think it worth holding because he wants to gather all his resources together in the Frostfangs, why are there no renegades like Craster taking advantage of the defenses? And what Jon realizes at a level he can't quite articulate is that no one is here because these defenses are not, in fact, adequate against what is really waiting for them up here. His superiors in the Watch, as we will again discuss later in the episode, insist on seeing their mission purely through the lens of stopping Mance Rayder. In that light, the Fist makes some sense as a defensive position. It makes no sense at all as a defensive position against the others and the army of the dead. That's what's waiting for them up here. That's why Mance didn't leave anyone behind. That's what Jon knows the Night's Watch is still not ready to face. And that's why George writes the Fist of the First Men as he does in these chapters, with such an eerie, alien atmosphere, with such palpable dread. The Fist just can't compare to Winterfell, which is the true Fist of the First Men. And as Stephen Atwell has argued, Winterfell might have been designed partially in reaction to the failure of the Fist's fortifications to stop the others' onslaught. But Winterfell, sadly, is on the other side of the wall. The Night's Watch is deep in enemy territory, and only Jon seems to remember who the enemy really is. It reminds me of one of my favorite show-only scenes, on the Fist of the First Men, in which Sam is talking wistfully about the first men who once held this fort, and Jon replies, "I think they were afraid. I think they came here to get away from something. And I don't think it worked." That perfectly sums up how L.C. Mormont's great ranging is going, and Jon already knows deep down how it's going to end for the Night's Watch.
I want to also argue, too, that the Night's Watch High Command is a pretty good idea that they're in the wrong spot and they're not going to make it out in the same form and fashion they came north with. Because I think, like, when I'm reading this chapter, Jon 4 especially, I see the High Command like trying to reassure themselves, assuaging their own doubts about the Fist of the First Men. As Mormont says, "This is good ground, Thorin. We could scarce hope for better." And then Thorin says, "Those heights will be easy to defend." And then Mormont replies, "Yes, we could scarce hope for better. We're not like to find better ground," Mormont says. Like, you just got to say this is a good place to kind of defend. You don't have to like keep trying to defend like the fact that you're holding this ground over and over and over again, unless you have some significant internal doubts, both Thorin Smallwood and L.C. Mormont, about whether this is actually good ground to hold or not. And as it turns out, as we find out from the prologue, from A Storm of Swords, as well as Samwell's first chapter, it ain't good ground to hold against the others and against the undead. And, you know, at some level, my sense is that the officers of the Night's Watch are all attempting to silence their own fears by overpraising the Fist, as all the while letting the same fears that Jon overhears Chet and Lark voicing go insane. Again, Chet and Lark are kind of the voices of reason in this chapter, which should be saying something, because at least Chet mentions that there are worse things out beyond than the wildlings, which seemingly does not factor at all in what Mormont is thinking about. That being said, while we're here on the Fist of the First Men, waiting to get annihilated by the others, let's talk a little about the concept of historical ring forts, because this was something that existed in especially European history. Ring forts were a defensive position, and sometimes a defensive settlement even, positioned on the tops of hills or high ground. Ring forts can be found all over Northern Europe, but they are found most prominently in Ireland, with as many as 50,000. I know, 50,000 is a lot. Constructed on the island between the Bronze Age and around 1000 CE. And if you're one of our patrons, and when we publish this episode, the show notes this upcoming Monday, you can see a picture of the ring fort that I found. I tried to look for a picture that looked the most like the Fist of the First Men maybe look like. Of course, this picture was taken in the summertime, not in the middle of winter, but I think you can get the idea pretty easily. And as a defensive structure, a ring fort offered high ground and visibility of the surrounding terrain. They also obstructed a maneuver up to the high ground, but there were limitations as the Night's Watch is fighting with the Fist of the First Men. But for our purposes, most rainfall would fall off or run off the hill rather side. Let me do it again. For our purposes, most of the rainfall would run off the hillside and create streams and bodies at the low ground of the Fist of the First Men, as opposed to being up where the men are actually stationed in position. And this is exactly what Jon is pointing out, as you were pointing out. It's fine ground to defend by force of arms, but an enemy advancing up the hill is only one way of defeating the ring fort. Starving them out in a siege is another way, something we are also going to talk a little bit later on. So I really like this idea that Winterfell and castles in general constructed as a more sure defense against the others, and it does fit the historical model of ring forts gradually being replaced by stone castles a little bit before, but especially after 1000 AC. But Jon isn't the only one who has reservations about the Fist of the First Men. Ghost seems awfully fucking perturbed too, and his reasons are less related in my mind to whether the Fist is truly good ground that Mormont seems to think it is. It seems to me that Ghost reservations are more rooted in the supernatural.
I think you made a great point that it's, in a sense, they're like traveling back into the past. Like, here's how we used to make our stand against the others, and we don't anymore. And at the same time as going back into the past, we're going back into the world of the supernatural. Those two are often linked in A Song of Ice and Fire and fantasy in general. And one of the best examples of how George plays up the spooky atmosphere of the Fist of the First Men in these chapters is how he uses Ghost. Jon's direwolf has always been, well, a ghostly presence, but he's never been as frightening as he is in A Clash of Kings, Jon 4. His red eyes glare balefully out of the night. He's running around, acting all spooked like he did the night of the zombie attack at Castle Black, as Jon says to himself. Immediately, the spooky atmosphere is ramped up, and the reader isn't sure whether to be afraid of Ghost or afraid of something he knows about. Jon chases after his dog, being a good boy, and we're prepared for him to come under attack, but instead, Ghost leads him to buried treasure. X marks the spot. And here again, we see the pattern of Jon's A Clash of Kings chapters, in which his fingertips just brush up in passing against the magical power that rules beyond the wall. A weirwood mouthful of skulls at Whitetree in Jon 2, an empty sheepfold at Craster's Keep in Jon 3, and now dragonglass arrowheads and a humble little horn at the Fist in Jon 4. These are signs and symbols of the monsters on the margins, to borrow your phrase about the others. And while George holds back on the White Walkers until the beginning of A Storm of Swords, he is showing us in A Clash of Kings a world permanently shaped by their presence, in which everything from the politics to the artifacts speaks to living on the doorstep of death's domain. It's telling that Jon thinks at first that Ghost is digging up a grave, because that's kind of the feeling out here. Everything is rooted in death. We'll talk more about the specific properties of the objects Jon finds in the foreshadowing and theory sections of this episode, but suffice to say that they stand in for the age of wonder and terror, in which mortal men rediscover the tools to reach up and grasp the stars, trying and failing to master death. What we see here in this bundle are the twinned elemental forces of ice and fire, which stand in for so much in the series, including Jon's birth parents, Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. And that ultimately is what this bundle stands in for. Frozen fire, wrapped up in a Night's Watch cloak, that's a perfect metaphor for our hero, Jon Snow. He found himself.
He went up north and he found himself. Yeah, I mean, that again, damn, dude. I mean, like, I remember when you did back in Catelyn's second chapter to Game of Thrones, and you pointed out that the hot spring water flowing through the cold stones was a metaphor for Jon, all the way back in 2018, we were doing our first few episodes. And again, I found myself floored by this catch. Of course, I read this before you guys actually were able to listen to this episode, but yeah, really, really well done, man. And just to add,
everything's a metaphor for Jon. That's what always comes back to in his story. You're seeing versions of the truth about him long before he realizes it.
The Song of Ice and Fire is actually all about Jon Snow. We can forget about all the other point of view characters. I know there'll be certain fans that'll be happy to hear about that. And because I wanted to add just another little layer about this, and to your excellent metaphor of the frozen fire as representative of Jon Stark and Targaryen heritage, I think we can also talk about Dragonglass as representative of his identity as a regular old Night's Watchman, as well as someone who has the magic inside of him, praise from Rest Development. As we know, Dragon Glass is based on real-world obsidian/volcanic glass, but in A Song of Ice and Fire, it has a magical twist, as George R. R. Martin talked about in a 2005 interview, in which he said, obsidian is, of course, volcanic glass. It's formed by immense heat and pressure down in the earth. The dragons themselves are creatures of intense heat. I've given it magical characteristics that are, of course, real obsidian doesn't necessarily have. After all, we live in a world that has no magic. My world does have magic, so it's a little bit different. So if dragon glass is a metaphor for Jon's identity, the magical elements that George R. R. Martin is embedding to the stone is also true for Jon. Jon is wearing the colors of the Night's Watchman, black, or shall we say, obsidian. So it's the normal garb of the Night's Watchman, but he's also a little bit magical too. He has a mystical Worgen connection to his direwolf ghost, and if season 8 is indication, and I totally think it is, Jon will have a magical bond with one of Dany's dragons as well. And that magical side of Jon, or at least his connection to the old gods as a Stark-ish, comes into focus when a Legend of the Watch finally arrives at the Fist of the First Man.
True, but Qhorin Halfhand, of course, takes his sweet time getting there. We'll find out why when he finally shows up. But yeah, a couple weeks go by. Qhorin Halfhand and the Shadow Tower men fail to show. The men start to get restive, and the officers go through their options. All they have to go on is Craster's intelligence, which puts Mance and his people high up in the Frostfangs, the mountains to the north of the Fist of the First Men. This presents the Watch with several obstacles. The most direct route into the mountains would be to follow the Milkwater, the river. But that would expose them to Mance's scouts, and any plan to fight Mance and the Frostfangs depends heavily on the element of surprise. There are passes through the mountains, the Giant Stair and the Skirling Pass, which could allow them to approach unseen, but the terrain and weather are extremely hazardous, more suiting for, say, a scouting operation than everyone at once. As such, L.C. Mormont says he would prefer to wait for Mance and his people to descend from the mountains and then fight them here on the Fist. But why? He says they couldn't hope for a better defensive position than the Fist, and that's true north of the Wall. But what about, the Wall? Qhorin's proposal to send in scouts to learn what power Mance seeks in the Frostfangs, that is a sensible and necessary move. That is something you should do while you're out here, because it's no good to retreat on the Wall if Mance has something that can bring it crashing down around you. But after that work is done, I am not the military mind on the podcast, of course, but it seems insane to me that you choose to give battle at the Fist instead of the Wall. The Wall is not only a much superior defensive position, it prevents you from being cut off from resources and messages to the south. The Fist can be surrounded.
Yeah, and it's actually even worse than you're putting it. Worse than being surrounded. You brought this really well up when we were talking about Jon's concerns about being dismissed. Surrounded and without access to a source of fresh water. That means if Mance attacked, all he have to do is move his siege and picket lines past the stream and bam, Mormont's men die of thirst a week or two later, or they surrender. And the High Command notes that they can use the Fist of the First Men as a staging base to launch surprise attacks against Mance once he comes out of the Frostfangs. But what are you fucking doing lining the hill with torches, you fucking illiterates? I mean, I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence here, but in the dark, with only ambient light around you, that line of torches is going to really stand out to anyone who has, say, the extremely rare gift of eyesight. If you just look, you are going to see these torches from 20 miles away. My God. Ugh. So any hope of launching a surprise attack against Mance is severely diminished by Mormont's lack of light discipline. But the issues with the Fist are deeper than the source of water and how they're visible from 20 miles away. It goes back to the strategic reasoning for the Great Ranging and why this mission is going foobar quick, fast, and in a hurry.
Yeah, let's pause to remember why it is they were supposed to be here in the first place. What is the Great Ranging? The Great Ranging was supposed to be first and foremost about gathering information, because sending out individual ranging missions wasn't cutting it. That's what Mormont says to Jon. I mean to find out what's out there, because honestly, we're barely getting any accurate information back. Mormont took this many men not to give battle to Mance Raider, but in order to prevent them from being taken down as easily as individual raiding parties, as Waymar Royce and Othor and Jaffar Flowers. Yet here Mormont is, preparing to give battle to Mance Raider, even though zombies tried to kill him in his sleep. Thorin Smallwood is sitting right there wearing Jeremy Riker's cloak, which he only has because a zombie killed Jeremy Riker. It's telling that this supernatural threat doesn't even get a mention in this council meeting. This is mission creep, the definition of taking your eye off the ball. Nor is there even a mention, by the way, of engaging in diplomacy with Mance in the face of this larger supernatural threat. Now, of course, the political culture of the Watch is such that the first person to propose such a move would be sticking their neck out, so no one does. That's the problem L.C. Snow will wrestle with in A Dance with Dragons. how to transform a culture whose roots go so deep that not even apocalypse can pull them up. I think that L.C. Mormont is preparing to do battle at the fist instead of falling back on the wall for the same reason he's talking about fighting Mance instead of the others, and it's the same reason Jon points out to himself, because he is a proud old man among younger men, who, as Tyrion notes, is afraid he's wasted his life, and so he wants to go out in a blaze of glory. He can't do that by sitting at the wall and waiting, even if that's the more sensible move. And unlike the others, he knows where Mance is and how to fight him, so he does. Just like Stannis decides to fight the Boltons because that's what he knows. For me, the point of the White Walkers is that they should galvanize all of humanity to work together, but humanity isn't that simple, even in the face of a threat like the others.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this one is another thing I love is getting to read your thoughts days in advance of everyone who gets to listen to them. Because let's be marinate in them. So I decided to do a little research. That is, I did a couple quick searches on A Search of Ice and Fire. And I think you're spot on with the whole Gior Stannis comparison here. I mean, let's look back at Gior's back in the game in Jon's final chapters in Game of Thrones and why he wants to go raging in the first place. So he tells Jon, I will not sit here meekly, wait for the snows and the ice winds. We must know what is happening. This time the Night's Watch will ride in force against the king beyond the wall, the others, and anything else that may be out there. This seems kind of clear-cut to me. Jon needs to find out what Mance is up to, ride out against the others, realizes that the smaller ranging parties he's been sending out, like mentioned Starks, are vanishing, and then he decides to move out in force. But here in this chapter, it's all about Mance Rayder and the Wildlings, all the while never mentioning the others who, are certainly closer up here at the Fist than they were down, at Castle Black and at the Wall. And that's the same and that's kind of the same mentality as what happens when our king arrives, that is, namely Stannis, when he arrives at the Wall. Where Stannis, in a storm of swords, tells Jon, demons made of snow and ice and cold, says Stannis Baratheon, the ancient enemy, the only enemy that matters. It stirs the fucking heart, man. The only enemy that matters. Quite correct, King Stannis. But then in A Dance with Dragons, does Stannis have second thoughts? As he says in Jon's 4th chapter in Dance with Dragons, Lord Snow, attend me. I've lingered here in the hopes that the wildlings will be fool enough to mount another attack upon the wall. As they will not oblige me, it's time I dealt with my other foes. You know who Stannis didn't mention in that line above from Jon's 4th chapter? The only enemy that matters, demons made of snow and ice. I mean, did he forget about it, or did he just kind of focus on something else here? It's always, it just drives me nuts. It's good writing on George's part, but it drives me nuts that it's always the wildlings that feature as the main threat in the minds of these military leaders, when truly the wildlings are men like us, as Qhorin Halfhand is going to put it later to Jon. And I wonder whether there's an element of just utter fucking fear and dread when it comes to the others for people as brave and gruff as Stannis and Jeor Mormont, that they kind of refuse to engage thinking about them and focus on the enemy who can be defeated. But I'm going to save a lot of those thoughts for A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons. So there's lots of mission creep foot, as you're pointing out, with Mormont, and also with Stannis, but he hasn't totally lost focus on at least one of his original core tenets of the mission, that is namely finding Benjen Stark, or rather having Benjen Stark find them.
Exactly. Credit where credit is due. L.C. Mormont is right that Benjen will be able to find them much easier than they can find him. And as a mentor, he does a great job of forcing Jon to reach that conclusion independently, rather than just spoon-feeding it to him. We are seeing the payoff to what Sam said in Book 1 about how Mormont was grooming Jon for command by choosing him as his personal squire, because it means Jon is always around when the decisions are made, soaking everything in. Sure, Jon's only officially in the tent to hand everyone their wine, but Mormont wants him to learn and tests him to make sure he is. Jon gets that this is how it works. That's why he offers to take food to Qhorin when Qhorin arrives over Dolorous Ed, because he wants to hear what's being said. And of course, he is the one Mormont sends to fetch Qhorin when Qhorin shows up. Without that little interaction, Qhorin wouldn't have ended up picking Jon to scout with him. So we are seeing that Jon having close physical access to the room in which decisions are made is actually having quite the effect on his burgeoning political career.
It's really good because I think, for all Mormont's faults, and he has a lot, as we've been pointing out in this episode, he does do this one thing right, in that he doesn't always give Jon the correct answer. He just calls Jon to engage his reasoning and rationing ability and determine what he would do in the situation. And he asks for Jon's advice in order to kind of suss out his ability and skill to actually lead after Mormont is gone, which is coming very, very soon, as we're going to find out here in a little bit into A Storm of Swords. But, Mormont is a father figure to Jon, and this is actually sad. I'd never realized this before. This scene from Jon's 5th chapter in A Clash of Kings is the last time that Jon Snow and L.C. Mormont are ever going to interact, because afterwards Jon is going to head off with Qhorin Halfhand. Mormont's going to get fucking bushwhacked by the others on the Fist of the First Men, and then he is going to die in a mutiny at Craster's Keep. It's a scene that now kind of fills me with a little bit of sadness looking at it in retrospect. But it does.
That last interaction is Mormont saying to Jon, "Yeah, I thought your will would be to go," and he's very sad as he says it. And yep, that's the last interaction. That is quite brutal.
It's brutal, but I think it does. Jon continuously thinks about Mormont and his example and his leadership throughout Storm and the Dance with Dragons. So it's not as though Mormont did die, but at least his spirit lives on in the form of Jon. Being poetic here, of course, it doesn't actually live on in Jon. But regardless, the passing of one father figure to another father figure means that we get to have another father figure, Qhorin Halfhand. And man, have I been excited about getting to this character here since probably before we even started the podcast, for sure.
I know he's a favorite of yours, and I like him a lot too. At last, Jon's new dad arrives with his 100 men from the Shadow Tower. The hard heart of the Night's Watch is now gathered on the Fist of the First Men. Qhorin Halfhand is a legend, the most admired ranger in the Watch now that Benjen Stark is missing in action. He is pure discipline, both physically and mentally, a born leader of men. The detail that stands out to a first-time reader, of course, is the story of how he got his nickname, losing 3 fingers to a wildling's axe before blinding him with blood. This establishes Qhorin's most prominent character trait, his willingness to sacrifice anything, absolutely anything at all, to further the goals of the Night's Watch. I don't think it's an accident that he will go on to sacrifice 3 men in the Skirling Pass, Dalbridge, Eben, and himself, with Stone Snake's fate left ambiguous. Or you could say he sacrifices Dalbridge, Eben, and Stone Snake, leaving himself with just Jon. Either way, I think it's interesting he's sacrificing the same number of men as the number of fingers he sacrificed, because that's Qhorin's philosophy. It's fitting that as we go further north into unknown territory than ever before, we meet a ranger who seems to thrive in the unknown, to live there full time. Qhorin's been ranging for so long, his black cloak is turning gray, separating him out from his fellow watchmen. He spent so much time up here that he has more in common with the wildlings he fights than with anyone south of the Wall. Qhorin's introduction reminds me of the introduction of Lietkynes in Dune. He officially works for the Emperor, but in appearance and how he carries himself, he feels like more like one of the natives. In fact, he's described as having gone native. That's how the Atreides men describe him. And this feeling is reinforced by how George writes Qhorin in Mormont's tent. Qhorin was seated cross-legged on the floor, his spine as straight as a spear. Candlelight flickered against the hard, flat planes of his cheek as he spoke. That's a very specific image. It reminds me so strongly of movies and TV shows I watched as a child of 80s, 90s pop culture, in which a Native American man would sit around a fire telling tales with like the light flickering on his face and a recorder on the soundtrack. This is a very typical trope. And I think George is specifically nodding to it. Qhorin is being framed as a shamanic figure, a storyteller with a deeper connection to the land and people around him than his fellow watchmen. And all of that is important because Jon's time with Qhorin is all about challenging his perspective on the wildlings and forcing him to immerse himself in their culture right before he goes undercover among them. On reread, it's actually kind of a misdirection how George presents Qhorin as the ultimate implacable enemy of the wildlings. Because in later Jon chapters, he will scorn Thorin Smallwood's bigotry, and he will think fondly and sadly of his old friend Mance. Mance, too, wears a watch cloak that looks different from the rest. Mance and Qhorin are both outsiders, caught between the worlds of wildling and watch. The difference is that Mance's cloak, with the red silk woven in, embodies his embrace of color, music, wine, women, life. Qhorin's cloak embodies his rejection of all of that in favor of duty. As Jon thinks to himself in his last chapter in this book, did Qhorin ever have a wedding night? Maybe not, but Mance did. In other words, Qhorin and Mance are outsiders on opposite ends of the spectrum. Their bond is rooted in their mutual rejection of what lies in between them. Qhorin believes that you must understand your enemy before you can defeat them. So it is fitting that he has more intelligence on Mance than Elsie Mormont, I think. And of course, go ahead.
No, go keep on. I'm loving this. I'm just like, I'm vibing it. As a kid,
thank you, sir. He got that intelligence, of course, by defeating Alfin Crowkiller, immediately establishing what a tough military leader he is. Yet, as Jon notes, Qhorin looks grave, indicating that this intelligence he gathered reveals something no short-term military victory can overcome. Jon is curious to find out what that might be, and he follows this curiosity into the tent, and that fits the theme of temptation that stands out so strongly in A Clash of Kings. On a kind of a very minor level, Jon is enacting the same kind of temptation you see with Stannis and Melisandre, or with Arya and Jaqen, Jojen and Bran. You're always, following them forward to find out what you don't know. Your curiosity drives you on. And what Qhorin's intelligence reveals is that, again, as always in A Clash of Kings, they are not inhabiting a purely political world, but a world in which politics and magic mix. L.C. Mormont looks at Mance's gathering in the Frostfangs purely in political terms, purely as a confederation of war chiefs, which will attempt to climb over the wall by normal means. And so in terms of the Watch's response, L.C. Mormont thinks only of patrols and manning abandoned castles. But Qhorin is here to tell Mormont to stop fighting the last war. This is the age of wonder and terror, and Mance doesn't want to climb over the wall. He wants to break it. That is a revelation designed to grab the reader's attention, and we are primed to spend Jon's chapters going forward wondering what this quote-unquote power might be. We shouldn't pass over, however, the manner by which Qhorin acquired this intelligence. Torture. Torture so intense that the wildling captive died from it. Qhorin is Jon's guide not only to the harsh world of the Frostfangs, but the even harsher world of sacrificing your values, your comrades, and ultimately yourself in the name of duty. That's another meaning to Qhorin's gray cloak. He is a morally gray man, a man who does some very questionable things in the name of his good ends. While there is much to admire in him, much for Jon to learn from him, there's the same question as with Arya and Jaqen H'ghar. Do we want our hero to grow up like this? Like Jaqen, Qhorin is a figure of death. He reminds L.C. Mormont that the Night's Watch wears black cloaks as built-in funeral shrouds. So if they drop dead on the spot in battle, you can just bury them right there and keep going. They are the walking dead, every bit as much as the zombies who serve the White Walkers. Again, you have Jon wondering if Ghost is digging up a grave in Jon 4. And then in Jon 5, I think it's no coincidence that George has Ed tell a story about drinking wine flavored by a suicidal brother's corpse. You know, Ed's stories are funny, but they tend to tie into the deeper, more serious themes going on in each chapter. It all fits the theme of death, the sense that the Night's Watch are all doomed. And the only choice left is how you face it. What do you do in the face of death? What do you be? How do you behave? And that is the core of Qhorin's Bushido-like philosophy, accepting the inevitability of one's death and thinking of one's life, as he puts it, as coin to be spent for the greater good. And finally, Qhorin's gray cloak reminds us of the gray banner of House Stark. And just in case it didn't, Qhorin's first conversation with Jon is all about House Stark. This is not incidental. It is Jon's connection to the First Man, emphasized by the direwolf prowling at his side, that prompts Qhorin to take Jon with him at chapter's end. As we will see in Jon's later chapters, Qhorin appears to believe that the Starks are, quote, friends to the Watch, in large part because the Starks are connected to the magic of the First Men and the Children of the Forest. Qhorin seems to be one of the people who understands that there must always be a Stark in Winterfell to hold the line against not only wildlings, but sorcery. It's interesting that Qhorin puts his faith in the Starks more than any Southron king. Despite not being explicitly a Northman, he seems to understand why the Starks are so important. Now, I say things like appears to believe and seems to understand, because Qhorin is not as direct as, say, Jojen Reed in terms of what he knows about the age of wonder and terror. So on one hand, Qhorin is kind of Jon's magical mentor in this book, right? Like Jojen, Jaqen, Melisandre, and Quaithe and the other Clash of Kings storylines. I mean, Qhorin talks about the wildlings seeking magic, bringing magic into this storyline explicitly. He understands that Jon is a warg. He knows what it means that Orell's eagle keeps following them in the Frostfangs. He's very familiar with this stuff. He's far more knowledgeable about and comfortable in this magical world than L.C. Mormont. But Qhorin doesn't have any magic himself, and it's not his primary concern. Magic matters to Qhorin in a military context. It is a tool our enemies know well. Its presence is a vital piece of intelligence that must be passed on. That's how he thinks about it. But for all Qhorin is able to talk about sorcery and dreams and the trees having eyes, he still never brings up the others, making the same mistake as L.C. Mormont. For all that he understands both magic and the wildlings better than the other senior officers, the former still hasn't changed how he handles the latter. And again, there's the Stannis comparison. Qhorin is another hard military man with a handful of devoted followers who understands magic, takes it more seriously than the rest of his peers, is willing to sacrifice anything for his struggle. But ultimately, he just can't give up the war against other humans he's been waging for so long.
That's all excellent points, man. I really appreciate you always talking through these kind of complex characters in a way that I think reinforces what George is presenting in the narrative. So well done, as always, sir. I think, you know, we're talking about father figures for Jon, and we're talking about L.C. Mormont and how he kind of fails as a father figure, but he does present some good aspects for Jon. He teaches him something about leadership, Qhorin, I think, was embedded in the narrative specifically because he ends up teaching Jon about the wildlings and about respecting your enemy. The kind of Bushido-like code that we see, as Steve Atwell has talked about specifically in his essays about A Clash of Kings and Jon's chapters. It's really telling to me that Qhorin does not talk about the others. And that leads us to another father figure of Jon's, namely Mance Rayder, who's going to be showing up at the start of A Storm of Swords in Jon's chapters. And also a little bit Ygritte as well, though she's not really much of a father figure. I kind of lost the metaphor there. That's okay. But regardless, is that all of these people are all kind of building up this leadership arc for Jon, starting with Elsie Mormont, moving on to Qhorin Halfhand, on to Mance Rayder, and then Stannis Baratheon himself in A Dance with Dragons. At the end of A Dance with Dragons, though, it's kind of unclear whether there's going to be any further father figures for Jon Snow. I think he's reached the pinnacle of his education as a leader and as a man of the Night's Watch, as the potential and probable king in the North, at least for a time. And now Jon is going to have to pick his own path going forward. And he's going to be hopefully taking the lessons he learned from Mormont, the good lessons at least, from Mormont, from Qhorin Halfhand, from Mance Rayder, from Stannis Baratheon, and then taking that and pushing forward in order to resist the coming advance of the others and their white allies. So all of that is just excellent stuff on George's part, to have these multiple father figures in Jon's arc, all presenting him with different types of mentorship figures for Jon, and hopefully driving him forward in the narrative so he can embrace his role as the person who needs to confront the others, because the others are coming real soon here, especially for the Night's Watch here at the Fist of the First Men.
You're your own dad now, Jon Snow. I do think that's where he's ending up. So moving on to foreshadowing and groundwork. Obviously, the major groundwork being done here is for the zombie attack on the Fist of the First Men, which will kick off A Storm of Swords. And you can find foreshadowing for that apocalyptic disaster all over these chapters. The senior officers consider the Fist an ideal fortress, but Jon senses its weaknesses. Those weaknesses will pay off. Jon thinks about how anything could be creeping toward them out of the haunted forest, and boy, will it ever. The one horn blast for Qhorin at the start of Jon 5, and everyone waits in the silence for the second horn blast. Well, that's going to become 3 horn blasts for others by the time you get to the prologue to A Storm of Swords. I think while writing A Clash of Kings, George already knew that this zombie attack was going to be one of the crown jewels of the series. And so he goes all in on setting the mood for it in these chapters before we leave for kind of like diversionary side quest in the Frostfangs.
Right. I mean, we're not going to pick up with Elsie Mormont until the prologue for A Storm of Swords. So we're like 40 chapters from our next visit with the Fist of the First Men. So George wants to really do the groundwork in order to build up that coming of the others here. So we have characters like Dywyn smelling the cold. We have Ghost going nuts at the Fist of the First Men. We've got Jon thinking specifically about Othor and about the Whites coming up and how no one can really be sure what's out in the forest itself. Everyone's like, oh, I don't want to be out ranging tonight, or any night for that matter. One second. So all that is building up to that coming encounter between the others and the Night's Watch at the Fist of the First Men. And kind of speaking about some of those sorcerous magical elements that are coming into play in A Clash of Kings, we're going to be learning much more about the, quote, power the wildlings sought in the Frostfangs in A Storm of Swords. It's the Horn of Jormungand, aka the Horn of Winter, which can supposedly bring down the wall. Mance Rayder is going to claim that he found it, and Melisandre then burns that horn in A Dance with Dragons. But Tormund, in Jon's penultimate chapter in Dance of Dragons, will claim that it was a fake, and the true horn is still out there. I guess the horn's just gone, man. It's just gone forever. We're never going to encounter it ever again in the narrative. Goodbye, horn.
Oh, but of course, it's that small horn that Jon finds in these chapters. It's just a wonderful irony that the power Qhorin is talking about in Jon 5 is probably what Jon found in Jon 4. Without realizing it, they're talking about the same thing. But while that hasn't paid off yet, something that in that bundle that has paid off is the Dragon Glass. That pays off in the next book as Sam uses it to kill an other in what might be the single most cathartic moment in A Song of Ice and Fire, when Sam hears like his father scorning him in his head and Jon telling him he can do it, and then he kills the White Walker the first time we see that done. That is a wonderfully cathartic moment at the end of a very bleak chapter.
It is a bleak chapter, but it's a top 5 all-time chapter in A Song of Ice and Fire for me. It's really amazing, that same old chapter. And yes, when he plunges the dragon glass dagger into the other, and the other kind of like melts in front of him, it's extremely cathartic after like you've been spending the whole chapter hearing men dying behind Sam. He can hear their screams as he's moving south to Craster's Keep. It's really haunting horror, amazing stuff. But then we're on into Sam like doing the good deed and bringing down an other, which is the first and only time so far in the narrative that an other has actually been brought down in the story. So that's so much fun. So Speaking of others, I guess, Qhorin Halfhand states that every king of the realm should hear news about the wildlings gathered, and this is exactly what happens to the Storm of Swords as Aemon sends letters to every king in the War of the Five Kings, but only one king responds. The king who cares. Ding! You didn't think we'd work another Stannis reference into this episode, did you? Oh, ye of little faith.
We do it every week, folks. We know it like we know our own skins at this point. So we always have Riot Watch in the King's Landing chapters in the Clash of Kings as George sets up the King's Landing riot to explode in Tyrion 9. And here we get Mutiny Watch. Jon witnesses Chet and company conspiring about getting off the Fist of First Men by any means necessary. They want to head south. They call the expedition the Old Bear's Folly. This, of course, feeds into what happens with Chet in the prologue to A Storm of Swords and later the mutiny at Craster's Keep. This is a classic bit of George's threefold revelation where he sneaks in a reference here. You know, if you're skimming, if you're a first-time reader, you might not pick up on what's going on with Chet, especially since Jon thinks to himself, oh, that was probably nothing. They're just spooked. It was just talk. And then you get the next layer of it with Chet in the prologue where he's planning the mutiny in his POV, but then that just gets like sideswiped by the others showing up, and you might think, oh, you might just forget about it entirely or think that it's just been rendered moot. But then the mutiny finally happens in a completely different form at Craster's Keep when the leadership of the original mutiny is already dead. So I love how George stretches that out over several books. It's great work.
Something that's just like kind of like I was thinking about it. It's like it kind of like it's funny to me that Jon could have like forestalled the mutiny, could have like warned Elsie Mormont, but it's like, no, man, I'm not gonna rat on my brothers of the Night's Watch, even a person like Chet and Lark, who I absolutely despise. So did Jon inadvertently help to cause the mutiny? Hashtag mutiny watch for the Night's Watch for Elsie Mormont. I mean, I'm not blaming Jon necessarily, but at the same time, Mormont has no idea what's coming when he reaches Craster's Keep in Samwell's second chapter in the Storm of Swords until it's way too late.
No, that's a good point. You know, it's the classic thing where good disarms itself. Jon cares about being a brother, being a comrade, caring about these men more than they care about him, so he kind of leaves himself open. But also Mormont, like, he still thinks he can order the mutineers around after they've already killed Craster and are rebelling to his face. So I gotta think, even if Jon directly told him that they were planning a rebellion, I don't know if he'd even believe it, because Mormont really wants to believe in the Night's Watch to the very, very end.
It's so tragic, though, his downfall, believing in the Night's Watch and having the same institution that he believes in ending up killing him. It's very George R. Martin and the irony that he loves to embed into the narrative. Final little bit of foreshadowing here is that Mormont and Qhorin talk about manning the abandoned castles of Greyguard and Long Barrow with recruits that Alistair Thorne is bringing back from King's Landing in order to hold the wall against the wildlings. Ironically, in A Dance with Dragons, LC Jon Snow will have these castles manned and rebuilt by wildlings with a few Night's Watchmen mixed in. So it's a kind of nice little ironic kind of turn back that we have George integrating here with the wildlings being the ones who are manning the castles that Elsie Mormont wanted to ban to prevent the wildlings from crossing the wall. And hopefully that's going to hold the wall against the others. It's not. I'm afraid it's not going to happen. I'm sorry to say.
It's that generational change in policy, same as Jon thinks about the gift and how Ned wanted to settle it, but he would have balked settling with wildlings. So Jon has to take all these wistful plans of his father's figures and put them into reality, but with people that his father figures don't see as people. Jon is the one who has to get past that bigotry and bridge that cultural divide. Mm-hmm. So that about wraps us up for foreshadowing and groundwork. Moving to the discussion portion of the episode here, folks. We've been building up to this one for quite some time. You knew we were going to fight about it. Well done, Jeff. You remember.
Thank you. I remembered, yeah.
The cue.
Yeah.
Oh, bless you, sir. So, we have the bundle that gets found by Jon and Ghost at the end of Jon 4. And it immediately raises the question of who left it. And you'll be surprised to learn this is one of the very few things that Jeff and I disagree about.
We do disagree about this factor of who actually left the mutiny, who left the bundle at the Night's Watch. I'm fucking this up. Let me do that one more time. Yes, we are definitely going to disagree about who actually left the bundle, although we may find some common ground at the end of our little debate. So, I guess now we kind of rip our shirts off and kind of like, I'm going to come through the camera.
You wish.
Yeah. So why don't you give me your wrong case for why it was Benjen Stark who left the bundle at the Fist of the First Men?
So this isn't really about direct evidence for me so much as it's just kind of a general feeling around it. Like Benjen comes up multiple times in these chapters, and it seems weird for me to have that there if it doesn't tie into what's happening in these chapters at all, just in terms of conservation of narrative detail. That seems strange to me. And if it's not him, he's contributed basically nothing to the story so far at all. And this might be the case. It just feels off to me that this really important badass who's in House Stark, who's a great ranger, has been like MIA beyond the wall. and has just had no impact on the plot whatsoever. As for the Night's Watch cloak, I think it's interesting that, Benjen might be trying to ditch the cloak to increase his chances of surviving in wildling territory. Remember what Jon said in book 1 about how a man wearing black would be viewed with cold suspicion in every village south of the wall? Well, same with every village north of the wall, too. As Mormont says, Benjen would know that the Watch would be kind of moving along this familiar path. I think he would know that the Watch would make for the Fist. It's a sensible place to leave a dead drop. Benjen is First Ranger, after all. He is a competent, devoted watchman. And if the fate of Othor and Jafer Flowers is any indication, he came up against the White Walkers. In those circumstances, I think he would devote himself to stopping the true enemy. I don't think he would make the same mission creep mistake as L.C. Mormont. And I think that's why he had the horn and the dragon glass there. I think he got to that stuff ahead of both Mance and the White Walkers. Meanwhile, if you look at Cold Hands, he still has his cloak. Now, that's not to say he couldn't have taken it off a corpse, of course. We will see him kill some Night's Watchmen in a dance with dragons, so he could have certainly taken the cloak off a previously dead watchman. And I do think that the magical angle with Ghost's involvement in finding the bundle is the best evidence that it was actually Bloodraven via Cold Hands or something involving the magical side of the plot and not Benjen, because Benjen's not really connected to that stuff. Then again, maybe he is now. If Benjen did run afoul of the White Walkers, he might now be directly swept up in Bloodraven's side of things, and that's why he knows about stuff like Dragonglass and the Horn of Winter. I mean, this is why a lot of people were convinced that Cold Hands is Benjen, right? Because it ties all this together. It would resolve this dilemma neatly. But George has said otherwise, so we are left to wonder. Now, make the case for why I'm full of shit, sir.
Oh, I'm not going to make the case that you're full of shit. I think you make excellent points about why Benjen could have been the person who left the bundle at the Fist of the First Men. But I'm going to argue a case that might seem a little bit tinfoil at first, which is that Cold Hands left the bundle there. And I'm going to argue it extremely successfully, too. But I think that it's, to me, let's talk first about the motive, about why Cold Hands could possibly want to do this. So we know from A Dance with Dragons that Cold Hands is a servant of Bloodravens, or perhaps even a white entirely controlled by Bloodraven himself. When we encounter the three-eyed crow in A Dance with Dragons, he seems quite focused on the threat of the apocalypse posed by the others. So you're welcome to go back a few years ago, but I wrote an essay series, which I'll link in the show notes for patrons, called The Race to Get the Horn South, in which I argued that Bloodraven was trying to get the Horn of Jormungand south of the wall to prevent the others from getting hold of the horn to bring the wall down. And Cold Hands cannot progress through the walls. We find out in Bran's final chapter in A Storm of Swords. So he needs some sort of human element to do that. So my theory is that Bloodraven sent Cold Hands with the horn and Dragonglass to the Fist of the First Men in hopes that the Night's Watch might eventually get south of the wall and get the horn to safety. He can't really give to Mance Rayder because Mance Rayder might want to bring down the wall itself. So that's the bare bones background and reasoning of why Cold Hands would be involved at all. Let's talk about the specific evidence for Cold Hands in these two chapters. As soon as the Night's Watch reaches the Fist of the First Men, Ghost starts acting strangely. He runs away 3 times from Jon at the start of Jon's 4th chapter, and when they arrive at the ring fort itself, Jon notes Ghost balked again. He padded forward warily to sniff at the gap in the stones and then retreated as if he did not like what he'd smelled. Then he takes Jon on a long chase at the end of Jon 4 through the hill until he comes onto the buried treasure. No, not Molestown, the actual buried treasure, the cache of Dragonglass. So Ghost doesn't like what he smells in and around the Fist of the First Men and acts kind of weird. Where have we seen this before? Why, back in a Game of Thrones, Jon 7, where the quote is, when he woke, his legs, as Jon's, were stiff and cramped, and the candle had long since burned out. Ghost stood on his hind legs, scrabbling at the door. Jon was startled to see how tall he'd grown. Ghost, what is it? He called softly. The direwolf turned his head and looked down at him, baring his fangs in a silent snarl. Has he gone mad? Jon wondered. And what was it that was driving Ghost mad back in a Game of Thrones, Jon 7? Why, it was smelling an undead Othor. Jon sums up Ghost in this chapter when he thinks the direwolf circled the fire, sniffing Jon, sniffing the wind, never still. It did not seem as if he were after meat right now. When the dead men came walking, Ghost knew. He woke me, warned me. So let's also stay on this whole smelling business, right? So back when Jon and Sam went to the Grove of Werewood's back in a Game of Thrones, Jon 6, Tywin and his magical nose makes its first appearance in the narrative, where Tywin says, "Best we be starting back, my lord," he said to Bowen Marsh. "Dark's fallen, and there's something in the smell of the night that I mislike." And then shortly thereafter, Ghost turns up with Jafer Flowers' hand, and then they find the bodies of Othor and Jafer. And then here in Jon's 4th chapter in the Clash of Kings, we get Tywin's magical nose coming into play again. "What is it you smell, Tywin?" asked Graham. The forester sucked on a spoon a moment. He had taken out his teeth. His face was leathery and wrinkled. His hands gnarled as old roots. Seems to me it smells, well, cold. Your head's as wood as your teeth, Hake told him. There's no smell to cold. And then Jon clarifies things. There's a smell to cold, thought Jon, remembering the night in the Lord Commander's chambers. It smells like death. So knowing that Ghost and Tywin could both smell whites, that Ghost acts up when the undead are about, let's turn to Cold Hands and do a real quick refresher, because it's been a little while since we've actually never encountered him in the narrative. We will encounter him in Storm of Swords, but let's do a quick refresher on a few points we know about Cold Hands. And note how, one, he's a former man of the Night's Watch, presently undead. He died a, quote, long time ago, according to the Children of the Forest. He's in service to the Three-Eyed Crow. And this is important. He has the smell of cold, blood, and death on him, as Bran notes. And then finally, Bran's direwolf Summer does not like that smell of cold blood and death on Cold Hands. And in my mind, a lot of those factors line up with finding the cache concealed within a Night's Watch cloak, to Ghost going nuts around the fist, to Tywin and Ghost probably smelling an undead person near the fist of the first men. I think my largest objection to Benjen playing the cache is that if it was Benjen, why wouldn't he just come up to the fist of the first men and deliver the goods and be like, here's the cache, guys, take care of this. I found it. It's probably important. We should, get it south of the wall. And there's something that Jon thinks about directly in Jon's 5th chapter. The cloak he had found beneath the fist could well have belonged to his uncle or one of his men. Even the old bear admitted as much. Though why they would have buried it there, wrapped around the cache of dragon glass, no one could say. So to me, it makes sense that Cold Hands couldn't present himself to the Night's Watch, given that they probably, try to fucking light him on fire on the spot. It's that whole undead thing. And why the cache was buried near the fist rather than delivered directly to Mormont. And that brings me to an elegant but potential solution. So we've debated now. I'm putting my shirt back on. We're done fighting here. So my potential solution that kind of takes both of our sides and joins them together is that George R. R. Martin, in his ever-gardening style, had it in mind that Benjen was actually Cold Hands while he was writing A Clash of Kings and A Storm of Swords. But then he decided that he had left himself a lot of wiggle room by not positively identifying Cold Hands. And somewhere between A Storm of Swords, written in 2000, and A Dance with Dragons, published in 2011, George R. R. Martin decided that he had a better idea for what Benjen was up to, or had a more interesting idea on the identity of Cold Hands. So is that a possibility as what could be linking our two ideas together, that George originally had Cold Hands as Benjen, and yet eventually decided that Cold Hands was not Benjen and had a better idea for the identity of Cold Hands?
You make a very convincing case, and I mean, certainly George likes leaving his options open in that regard. Like, that singer at the Winterfell feast back in book 1, he never identified him by name. So if George later wanted that to be Mance, it can be Mance. And the same thing might be going on here, and that's why there's a slight incongruity here. I do say, though, you were convincing me as you were going there. You laid it out very convincingly, step by step, in terms of the smell and how that's associated with the old god stuff and with corpses, and all that does speak to Cold Hands. And part of me, when you bring up the question of why doesn't Benjen just give it to them, and part of me is just like, well, because it's a story. And if he does that, there's no story.
That's true, yeah.
But no, you make a good point, and maybe Benjen couldn't do that because he's on the run. Maybe he was being tracked, and he's like, I got to drop this off now, lead them off in another way. But that's completely fanfic on my part. It's a legit point, though, that Benjen could just walk back up to the Night's Watch, whereas Cold Hands really can't, because as soon as they see him, they'll be like, "What is that? Kill it with fire." So that's a legit point. And the aura of magic around it definitely points in the Cold Hands direction. The cloak itself, for me, kind of indicates Benjen, and if it's not Benjen, I wonder what he's up to, and that's what makes me lean towards your kind of in between solution, where George may have changed ships in midstream, so to speak, here.
Yeah, so it's possible that it was Benjen, and I do like a lot of the things you do bring up a great point, that Benjen is brought up specifically in this narrative multiple times. It's like Benjen will follow the trail. Benjen is going to be here. If Benjen is alive, he will follow us here. But there's also a possibility too that he's undead as well, just like Cold Hands. It might not be that Cold Hands is the only servant of Bloodraven at this point in the story. So it could be all those factors put together. Benjen could be undead. Benjen seemingly was undead in season. Does he show up in season 6 or season 7 of Game of Thrones?
It's season 6 with Bran, and then 7 with Jon.
Right, and I remember I was calling him like Ben Hands, like back in the day, because it was funny. I don't know why it wasn't actually that funny, because he wasn't actually Cold Hands, but though it was sort of indicated that he was Cold Hands in the story, or the Cold Hands figure in the story. But I do think that there's a possibility that he was reanimated by Bloodraven if he had died, because it is interesting that in a Game of Thrones he is not among the 2 corpses that the Night's Watch find out by the Weirwood Grove. So He's out there somewhere, whether he was picked up by the Children of the Forest, as Benjen indicates in, season 6 of Game of Thrones, and was reanimated by the three-eyed raven, I guess, in the show, or by the Children of the Forest directly with the dagger. It's unclear, but I think it could be multiple things going on at the same time. But here's something I think is interesting. I think there's a number of theories that I think are just flat out wrong, that I just despise just on nature of them being wrong. But there's a number of interesting ones in the middle. Think of things like Tyrion Targaryen, or like this, whether it's Benjen or Cold Hands, that I don't think are flat out wrong, that I think have a lot of evidence for and against these factors being in play in George's narrative. And I think that's a fun way that George does some mysteries, because I think this is supposed to be something that we're left to ponder. Some things that fans have come up with in terms of theories are not necessarily aspects of the story that George has wanted us to ponder, but because there's been a nearly 10-year-long wait for the Winds of Winter, because there's been, an even longer wait since the Feast of Crows for some of these characters, that we end up developing theories that are way out there, way outside the mainstream, because we have lots of time on our hands waiting for that next book to come out. So, but this is one of those ones I feel that George has specifically invested in order to leave us in mind of who actually was the person who dropped off that cache of dragon glass. It could be Benjen, it could be Cold Hands, and hopefully the Winds of Winter will definitively reveal the truth of it.
See, we didn't fight that much after all, kids. We're staying together for Christmas, I promise.
We absolutely are. So I think that about wraps us up for this episode on the Clash of Kings, Jon 4 and 5. For you guys who are watching us on the live stream portion of this episode, we will stick around for a little while to answer some questions, chat with you guys as we like to do, and talk with you all a little bit more. As always, if you have the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, anywhere and everywhere you find our podcasts.
You can, I almost lost my place here.
Okay.
You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotaCastASOIAF. You can follow us on Twitter at NotaCastASOIAF, or shoot us an email at NotaCastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at PortQuentin on Twitter, or at PortQuentin.com.
And you can find me at Brendan Beavish on Twitter, Brendan Beavish on Reddit, and my website is warsandpoliticsofIceandfire.wordpress.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon: Lord of the Squishers and Warden of the Deep, Lady of 1,000 Words, Septon Eastwood of Introvert Isle, Septon Maribald, the Shoeless Sage, Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood, Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North, and Keeper of Secrets, Sandy the Dragon, Blood of Queen Daenerys and Lady of Jameson, Lady Britt, Bastard Mistress of Harrenhal, Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood, Sir Tim the Knight who was guided by voices, Lady Dillsdale, the Star Spear of Crescent Hill, Sir Way of Course, Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore, Lord Mark Connington, Heir to Griffin's Roost, Lord Sam Kay, Sir Michael Mertens, Wisdom Benjacut, Alchemist of Stetson Quanta, Mage of the Arts of Boole and de Morgan, Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping, Lady Raj, Mistress of Horse, Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies, and Septon Merryful Headafair. Thank you very much to all our high lords and ladies.
Absolutely, guys and gals, and everyone else. Thank you so very much for supporting us. We really appreciate it. So join us next week as we return again to Winterfell for Brand 5. Again, we are not going with the published order. We are going to Brand's 5th chapter, and we're going to be talking about Catelyn in the month of April, in which Jojen digs deeper into prophecy and the heavy price Brand's going to have to pay along the way to destiny.
And we meet Reek, servant to the Bastard of Bolton, who was built up as a major villain, but is now suddenly, seemingly, been killed off screen. Nothing suspicious there.
Crisis averted, guys. The Bolton threat has been just averted. That's that. Good to know. We're done with Reek. Oh boy. Oh my God. It's gonna get real shitty here for Bran and for Winterfell for the rest of A Clash of Kings. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you guys who have been watching us for watching us. We will see you guys next time.
Okay.
All right.
Brilliant. Awesome.
It's a fun episode.
Very fun. Thank you folks in the chat for sticking around if you are. We'll take questions and hang out with you for a while.
Yeah, it was a really good one. I think I was saying this in the pre-episode, in the mini episode we do every week for our high lords and ladies and our small council members, is that I feel like these Jon chapters in the Clash of Kings are really theory dense when we come from like Craster's Keep onto this chapter here with the Cache of Dragon Glass. It's interesting on multiple levels that George has been seemingly wants to have a lot of mystery for Jon's storyline, and I really like Jon's Clash storyline. I'm really going to enjoy Jon's Storm of Swords storyline, but of course I think it's the best storylines in A Dance with Dragons for sure.
Agreed. I mean, Jon has the big mystery of his parentage around him. It makes total sense that these smaller mysteries would orbit him as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. First question comes from Lady Aaron M, who asks, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what kind of magic you think the wall is meant to protect against. Is it only keeping things out of the north rather, or is it also protecting things coming from the south?
How does it work with the direwolf streaming of each other again? Is it blocked both ways or not? I forget off the top of my head.
Jon loses his connection when in a Dance of Dragons or in a Storm of Swords until Ghost comes south, right? Because he loses that kind of mad working connection.
Right.
Or is it a but yeah,
I'm trying to think, isn't there like a brand? Isn't there something where one of them can't sense Summer or Summer can't sense them? I forget which direction this works in. But regardless, I think, I mean, the wall, I think, as Melisandre says, it's a hinge of the world, has ancient spells woven into it like in Storm's End. It seems to affect a lot of both physical presence and just kind of general astral connections north and south. But not everything, as we see with Bloodraven. So it's unclear, and I think deliberately unclear as to what exactly the rules are with that.
And Maddie brings up a great point in which she says, and I'll put it up here for everyone to see. She says, it clearly has some effects on Southern magic because dragons don't want to cross the wall. That is something we referenced at the start of this episode with Alisane's dragon not wanting to cross the wall. As many times as she attempted to do it, the dragon would always bank away from the wall at the last minute. So it does seem to have some sort of magical effect on people coming south to north, but also north to south, as we saw in the example of Cold Hands at the end of A Storm of Swords.
Absolutely.
All right, Broken King asks, do you think Dunk and Egg will go to Essos and maybe interact with the Golden Company or the Blackfire Court directly? The answer to that is yes, because we know that George has a number of Dunk and Egg stories that he has tentative titles for, and there's a couple of them that seem to be pointing very strongly towards Dunk and Egg venturing, or at least Dunk venturing over to Essos to beat up with the Golden Company, namely the one being called the Sellsword, if I'm not mistaken. I know Aziz is in the chat, and he can maybe double verify for me, but I think the Sellsword is the one that likely is going to have Dunk interacting with the Golden Company and interacting potentially with Bittersteel too.
Be awesome. Bittersteel's a fascinating historical character to me. I'd love to get a sense of his temperament, and a sense of Essos in another time period would be interesting. Get to see that kind of Tyroshi Blackfire Court in exile, but I try to stay optimistic about the Winds of Winter. I feel less need to be optimistic about our odds of ever getting another Dunk and Egg book. I know George says we will, but we'll see.
We shall see indeed. All right, this is an excellent question from Sir Mubarak M, who asks, what is your biggest criticism of A Song of Ice and Fire? I'm just going to let you answer this one. I'm going to sit back here for a moment.
The Dothraki... There were ways the Dothraki could have been made more interesting that are just not hard to imagine and not difficult to imagine George writing. And as I've said before, with other areas of Dany's storyline, I get the point that she feels alienated and she's the POV, so there's a wall up for us as well. I get that. But the Dothraki, she's supposed to have bonded with them. And I still challenge anyone to tell me the difference in personality between any of her three Blood Riders. You can't do it. So that's such a...
They have different names.
They have different names. Good for them. That's such an omission that I'm tempted to go with that. People have also pointed out how he falls back on the mother died in childbirth trope, which is true, and oftentimes that comes off as lazy. But I also get it. It's cheap, easy, drama backstory. So I was trying to think of a lot of the things that I would say I like less than other things in A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm like, oh, but I get why it's that way. I get why he relied on that. The way the Dothraki are written, that just strikes me as a lack of imagination. I have difficulty coming up with another explanation for that.
Well, everyone is saying Karth in the chat, which I do agree with. That is the weakest part of the storyline. But we're talking about A Song of Ice and Fire. I think it's the weakest part of A Clash of Kings for sure.
But again, at least I get what the idea of Karth is supposed to be. I don't think the execution is great, but the Dothraki, I'm like, what? Come on, you knew these kills were going to be a big deal, that they were going to be following Dany to the end, and there's still just nothing.
Yeah, I mean, there's only 20 of them left in Dany's side at the end of A Dance of Dragons, or at least the ones that are left in Meereen. They go out searching for Dany in the Dothraki Sea. They don't find her, but we'll see if George hopefully rights the ship a little bit with the Dothraki in the Winds Winners. We know that Dany is likely going to have a significant Dothraki arc in the Winds Winter, so we'll have to see there. I think for me, briefly, this is how do I phrase this correctly? This is something that I feel is very much not. It's not meant to be a criticism of George R. Martin as opposed to the greater cultural relegation of A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones as being ripped from the pages of history. And I'm like, yeah, sort of ish, but like one of the things that I think is really interesting about George R. Martin and is that is an element of popular history that he is pulling material from, but a lot of it is actually more like inspired by historical fiction, by some kind of popular historical conceptions of history that don't really jive with what the modern academic conception of history is. I wrote an essay about the Battle of Ice, which is going to be one of the battles that's going to occur at the start of the Winds of Winter between Stannis and the Boltons. And there's this idea that the Battle of Ice is inspired by the Battle in the Ice, which was a battle that took place in the 13th century between Teutonic Knights and Crusaders who were fighting against the Republic of Novgorod. And I was thinking about it. I was like, I think it's more likely that George was inspired by the actual depiction by Alexander Nevsky's Battle of Ice, which was a movie that came out in the 1930s. It's an extremely impressive film. And I do recommend everybody watches this as well. Watches the movie, especially because there is a scene which has the Battle of Ice, which has all of the Crusaders falling through the ice. But then when you actually get into the historical sources, there was no people falling through the ice. There was also the potential that the battle didn't actually take place on the ice lake itself, that this was something that was invented by Alexander Nevsky as the person who was the filmmaker from the 1930s. So to me, it's always seems to me less that George was inspired by history as it actually happened and more inspired by the sometimes popular, sometimes wrong types of history, if that makes sense.
I think he's more interested in like our relationship to mythology and storytelling in the past, just in general, more than like specifically recreating a given period of it. And he, of course, he comes at it with the values of his own era. And yeah, I think I think that's good to have a distinction between how A Song of Ice and Fire is marketed and how it actually is as a reading experience, because I think they're different things.
I agree there. All right. Sorry, I just got lost there. I just started monologuing and
Oh, you good. Let's see what we got here. Going back up. We got one from Micah about if word and evidence of the others came to the fist around the time of Halfhand, how might Gior react? Would he train strategy? How would the Night's Watch there react? It's he already saw zombies attack. I'm not sure what more information Mormont needs. Even when you get to after the attack, it's you still get stuff like people doubting that Sam killed another. I think we tend to think about these things in terms of how we would react if we we're told about a giant zombie army. We might think we'd run to the ramparts. But Jeff, how would you react if your neighbor told you very earnestly that a zombie army was coming? Would you believe that a zombie army was coming, or would you believe that your kindly neighbor had snapped?
The latter, obviously. I mean, like if my neighbor Nick is his name came over to me and said, "Hey Jeff, there's a zombie army that's approaching and we're all going to die," I would be like, "Nick, I think you should stop smoking the marijuana. I think it's time to actually sober up and you have a child, for God's sake." I mean, it's one of those aspects that I think we as readers, when we go back and we're looking at Mormont's actions at the Fist of the First Men, we're like, it's understandable why he doesn't necessarily view the threat of the others as something that is actually going to happen. At the same time, though, Mormont has been attacked by a resurrected Othor, and Jeremy Riker has been killed by Jafer Flowers. So he does have some evidence in mind, and he also sends, Sir Alistair Thorne south with the hand of Jafer Flowers in the hopes that the South would take it and react to it. But seemingly he's not reacting the same way to it. So it's it's I understand, but at the same time it's a little bit hard. It's a little bit not great on Mormont's part. Mick Max says, "Hi guys, I know it's random and kind of unrelated, but Emmett, has anyone ever told you that you look like Edward Snowden with your glasses?"
This has been asked several times in the chat already and answered. Yes, it's been mentioned. Several airport folk have made this clear to me.
Have you ever been stopped and searched? Has anyone been like, "Hey, do you have
not
any recent travels to Russia?"
Not searched, but they've definitely given me an eyebrow or two, and I have to stand there and sweat. Thankfully, I'm at the airport. I'm wearing clothes I can sweat in. That's what they exist for, to be sweated in at airports. So that's something.
Oh my gosh. All right. Let's see here. What do we else?
Tell Jeff it looks like Tucker Carlson. I don't know.
Whoa.
That would be a terrible thing to tell a human being. I would never say that to my worst enemy, let alone you.
I'm never gonna stop seeing Edward Snowden in you.
So I don't have quite the set of balls on me as Edward Snowden. So
there was, I think Zach had asked somewhere above, like, when are we going to have the crossover Girls Gone Canon, not a cast episode, or when we're going to switch out hosts? And I would note that we have had both hosts of the Girls Gone Canon podcast on several episodes in the past, and both Emmett and I have participated in Girls Gone Canon episodes in the past as well, and maybe participating in Girls Gone episodes in the future too. So keep a lookout, I guess.
Absolutely. Getting all four of us together would be great, but also, that might be a lot. There might be too much power in one non-existent podcast space. Be careful what you wish for.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we have Micah who asks, what do you two like about Daiwen? What makes him the real Norse MVP? I mean, it's the wooden teeth.
It's the wooden teeth clacking them together. Plus, it's just, anyone who just tells the stories like he does. Someone compared him to Old Nan in the chat. I forget who, but that's why. It's that same kind of appeal.
Yeah, and he's also done really well by Roy Dotrice in the audiobook because he's always like sucking in his teeth. Like it's so much fun to listen to Roy do Daiwen, R.I.P. Roy. So it's all good stuff. Let's see here. It's not about guest hosting. It's about host swapping. So you're asking. So Zach is asking if the Girls Gone Canon podcast is going.
April Fool's Day is coming up. I'm not saying
true.
Anything.
We should give them.
It's also Chloe's birthday, so
But I'm not going to give up Catelyn 3. I'm just not. I'm sorry.
True. Next year, then.
All right.
I like Chloe both laughs out loud, and I can hear her because she's 15 feet away.
Too, yeah.
And types ha 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 into the chat. Both. So everyone can hear. Mr. Bernie supporter, so he's a Russian agent like all of us. Yes, clearly. I love that we've turned like the barely functional plutocratic gas station that is Russia into the source of all our woes. I understand that they, empower bad actors all over the world, but seriously, people.
Yeah. Russia's
anyway.
Russia's bad. Don't get me wrong, but definitely not the source of all evil. Okay, Micah asked, "Did you vote for Theon or Egg in A Song of Madness? We demand the truth of it." And I voted for Theon because I like Theon as a better character. I mean, I love Egg. I love the Dunk and Egg stories. I think
I love the idea of Egg as a character, but so far he's just like he's kind of a smart ass. I love the kid, but like what's interesting about Egg is because you know where he's going. I think Theon is more interesting and to read.
Yeah, and plus he's going to have chapters in the Winds of Winter, multiple chapters, as we know. We have the one sample chapter, and George was working on an additional Theon Winds of Winter sample chapter back when he was doing his major Winds of Winter not a blog post back in 2016. So lots of Theon to come in the Winds of Winter. I think it's something I brought up before, but I think it's interesting is that I think among like the POVs that we have in the Winds of Winter, I think the Ironborn are likely going to be among the most prominent POVs, perhaps maybe even eclipsing the number of Stark point of view chapters in the Winds of Winter. We'll
maybe.
See.
We'll see how quickly they die off. Aeron and Victarion are probably going to go early, but we'll see.
We will. We got a question about when our next Fever Dream episode is coming out. It is coming out this week. So it is out for our small council members right now for Chapter 7 of Fever Dream. It'll be out for our High Lords, Ladies, and Kingsguard tomorrow. It'll be out for Sworn Swords on Wednesday and out for Poor Fellows on Thursday. It's a good chapter. I think you guys are actually going to like it a lot. There's a lot to pull out from this very short chapter, but we gave it a all. I think it's really, really good.
Absolutely.
Manny asked why I screw over Corlys Valerian. I don't know what you're talking about. Me screwing over a character in A Song of Madness? This doesn't sound like
Don't question Jeff and how he uses his power in this regard, folks. He waits all year for it. He earned it.
Absolutely. Matilda D asks, I'm pretty convinced on my reread that Jon will claim Winterfell once he gets resurrected. Do you think he will marry Val to win the wildlings to his claim?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I do think Jon's probably going to end up king in the north at some point. I don't know. I still think Val might be who's waiting for him on Endgame, as I said before. But that could certainly involve them getting married first. I mean, we've all said that Jon's going to be a little wilder, coming back, a little more dangerous. Is that the kind of person who would want to marry Val, forsake his vows, or is he the kind of person? He's going to be coming back the kind of person who doesn't want to marry anyone and wants to be even more isolated than ever. I could argue that either way. I do think he will eventually end up with Val, though.
At least for a short time. Hopefully Val survives the events from early in the Winds of Winter. She's in a pretty precarious situation, and she also has monster in handy there. So it's a precarious situation for her. I think she's going to be very prominent in the Winds of Winter, and we'll see what happens with her. But yeah, I can see her getting together with Jon, if not nothing more than a stopgap for Daenerys, which is I think is the ultimate end game for Jon. But maybe they get back together after Jon gets exiled north of the Wall. We'll see. All right, Map Guy asks, Jeff, why don't you like A Feast for Crows? And Emmett, why is A Feast for Crows the second best in all of Song of Ice and Fire? Well, I do like A Feast for Crows. I just don't. How do I put this politely in a way that my co-host will still love me afterwards?
Sure.
It's the Ironborn, man. I think there's lots of great Ironborn stuff in A Feast for Crows. I think it's really interesting, but I think the Dorne is more interesting than the Ironborn chapters, and there's only 4 Dornish chapters if you count Arizokard in A Feast for Crows. The Ironborn stuff is fine. It's totally fine. I like it fine. It's just that it's just not my favorite setting. It's really kind of a shitty place and setting, and I think that Naga's Bones is a really interesting setting in one sense, but in the other sense it's kind of like, I don't know, it reaches too far into fantasy for me. I guess that's ultimately where I'm coming down for. And now
perfectly fair. I love the Ironborn chapters in Feast. I think they're basically perfect structurally, but the tone I understand is not for everybody. Personally, I don't know. I might rate Storm above Feast if I'm being completely honest, but I tend to just get defensive about Feast because I think a lot of the criticisms thrown at Dance are legit. I just don't care about them because Dance is still my favorite. But a lot of the criticisms thrown at Feast, I read them and I'm like, did you not read the book? So I love Feast because I think it's just a perfect follow-up to Storm, and I think it shows you exactly what Westeros would be like after that kind of bloodletting, after those mighty pillars fall. It just makes you sit in it and stare at characters like Cersei and Euron and Victarion. And I think that's actually really powerful. And I think it's also just a really beautifully written book in a lot of ways. And a lot of my favorite scenes and chapters take place. And it's just, in terms of tone and its approach to its material, it's very, very singular and very distinct. And like A Storm of Swords is like the best version of kinds of stories I've read before. Feast feels unique to me in a way that the rest of the series does not. And that's in part just an accident of how it was written, because it was not supposed to be like that at all.
I do agree with that. It is unique among, I mean, I'm not as versed in fantasy as you are and as many of our readers are, but I do think it is kind of unique in that it does kind of like marinate in the consequences of all the action we saw in the first 3 books in a way that I don't see a lot of fiction necessarily do, and kind of like sit back and kind of like relate to how people are reacting to all the violence and horror and terrible things that have occurred in the story. And it does do a good job, I think, of setting up future violence, horror, and action in the Winds of Winter, in the form of the Ironborn, in the form of Stoneheart, in the form of various other characters that we encounter in A Feast for Crows. So I absolutely love A Feast for Crows. In my first read through, I did not. I was among the very popular opinion that A Feast for Crows and A Dance of Dragons were George's weakest works, until I started to actually like consider what the messages and the thematics that George was embedding into the stories, and it ends up coming a lot better for me, and on a reread especially.
They are the weakest if you just want a book to read, like for an hour. Like Feast and Dance will drive you insane if you just want to do that, because they hate you for the idea of doing that. Feast and Dance are really mean anti-audience books, and I completely understand why people just react negatively to that. But if you want a deep dive, and if you love this world on its own terms and the writing on its own terms, Feast and Dance are endlessly rewarding. And of course, we will get to that at length years down the road.
Absolutely. All right. Joe Schmo 725 asks, is Dany going to burn Volantis? Yes.
Parts. The rich part. Again, Dany's arc in Winds, I think, is going to be the step-by-step thing, like her story as a whole, where it's like, okay, I'm on your side. That's justified. Okay, that's a little harsh. Kind of still on board. Oh no. And I think Volantis is a key part in that, in which I think she will go ham on a larger scale than she has before. But I think she's going to focus it almost entirely on the people behind that big black wall in Volantis, the old blood on the other side of the bridge. I think Volantis is like geographically set up that way in large part to make it possible for Dany to do that. And that's going to be different when she gets to King's Landing. So I think Volantis is supposed to be connective tissue between Slaver's Bay and King's Landing in terms of how Dany handles these kind of situations.
Right. I mean, at some level, it's going to be, you as an audience, we're going to feel a sense of catharsis in Dany burning the black city in Volantis, the old blood, so to speak, because of their the shit that we see in Tyrion, Victarion, John Connington's, and Quentin's chapters in A Dance with Dragons, and they're unleashing their fleet against Daenerys Targaryen at the end of A Dance with Dragons on into the Winds of Winter. So I think it'll feel cathartic, and I think that's going to be one of those turns that George is going to be integrating. So you're talking about is going to be a ramping up of going from Slaver's Bay on into Volantis, and then on into Pentos, and then on into Westeros, and then you're like, at some level, like we're going to feel less of a feeling of catharsis as Dany keeps on massacring these people, because some people do have it coming. Obviously, the Slavers being the most prominent example, but does King's Landing? No.
Well,
No.
and of course, this is a long discussion of Dany's story, but being a revolutionary in one society is just different from how you are in another society, and there's no slaves to free in Westeros, and Westeros is where Dany wants to restore a power structure instead of shake it. So there's lots to say about that kind of changing dynamic, and I don't think the show, on retrospect, it's not that for me the show got it wrong so much as it just moved through things so quickly that for a lot of people it felt rushed.
Agreed. Charles E.A. asks, what do you think the Danes' original purpose in the plot was? So back
to bore me. I don't know, who said that?
All right, I'm just gonna let you take care of this one. You can deal with the comments on this one.
No, but what do you think, Jeff? What were the Danes originally for before the story kind of changed in ways George didn't expect?
I think so. If you go back, there's a 2002, I want to say, like summary or synopsis of what A Feast for Crows was going to be, like an Amazon release, and that was confirmed to be legitimate at some level coming from George R. R. Martin, in which that Starfall was going to be where Daenerys Targaryen came and Jon Snow potentially came there as well, and all the mysteries were unpacked there at Starfall. And yeah, it's a lesser story than the one we actually have, at least in published form right now. I think originally it was going to be where Jon finds out his heritage, that he's actually the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, and that Daenerys, I guess, finds out that her father was mad, I guess, although that's kind of been communicated in other venues than, the Danes. And I also think, too, as
they're pretty. They have purple eyes and a magic sword. Note my interest.
Oh my goodness! I never knew that you were not a Dane fan, a fan of House Dane. I'm not either. So
they're fine. Chloe has found far more romance and mystery and intrigue in them than I ever could. Her Dane content is amazing. I never could find the spark there. In the same way that not everyone recognizes how awesome the Ironborn Feast chapters are. So everyone has their own area of this story they love. The Danes were just never mine.
Yeah, I mean, Edric Dane seems cool.
He seems nice. I hope he doesn't die.
Darkstar, you got Darkstar.
I do love Darkstar, but not in remotely the way I'm supposed to. Not even close to the way the author intended. I enjoy Darkstar in a thoroughly ironic fashion. But the Danes strike me as the people that a much lesser fantasy story would be entirely about. And so they interest me mostly in that way, like gesturing like, oh, look at these people who aren't the main characters, even though they look like the main characters. How about that? Man, I'm not going to survive the night, judging from the noises I'm hearing in the next room. Again, Chloe's done amazing stuff on Ashara. Arthur Dane is really the one who doesn't interest me at all, because he's just like, okay, he's perfect.
Well, I think that George integrated a little bit. He's integrated a little bit of ambiguity in Arthur Dane, for being completely fair, and that he's like, people have asked him like, well, how is it that Arthur Dane was able to, he's this chivalric knight, the epitome of being a knight in Westeros, and yet he stood by alongside of Barristan Selmy and did nothing when Aerys Targaryen was visiting his horrors on Rhaella, of course, most of the kingdom, or at least the nobility of the kingdom. So George has indicated that there is more to learn about Arthur Dane, which may contextualize him a little bit more. That seems to be something that may be of interest, at least maybe, in terms of like how Barristan.
We already have Barristan chapters now, so I feel like haven't we done this? Maybe.
But yeah. No, you're right. You're right about that. Yeah.
Again, this is not me saying the Danes are poorly written. This is just me saying I am not the one to turn to. I think Chloe's done amazing work on Ashara Dane.
That's absolutely true. All right, Nikhil J asks, is it tinfoil to think Tyrion was the intended target of Littlefinger's poison at the Purple Wedding? Yes. Okay, so this is...
I feel like I need to reread that.
Okay, so I can explain this, I think.
Okay.
So there's a theory that exists out there that it was not actually Joffrey they were trying to poison. It was Tyrion who Littlefinger was attempting to poison. And there's some theories that the poison was not in the wine cup. It was in the cream of the pie or something like that. And It was in the pie itself. I know you're looking at me like I'm the one who's giving you this theory. Like I believe in this theory. I'm just trying to give you
of course.
the background for this theory.
I won't poison the messenger.
But thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, no strangler for me. This is tinfoil. I think this is an example of a theory that I genuinely dislike. And it's not that I genuinely dislike it because I think the people who hold the theory are bad. Although all of them are bad. Some of them I'm sure are fine.
Everyone is bad, just some are worse than others. Anyway.
Look at you, a little Calvinist there. Yeah.
Right.
But I think that this theory is one of those theories where I think that you have an overactive imagination of the fandom, because George R. R. Martin provides the explanation in a lot of detail in A Storm of Swords about what the poison was intended to do, how it was transported into the Purple Wedding, how Joffrey was able to get the poison, how then Joffrey then choked and died. And we have the example of Crescent from the Clash of Kings prologue, who then drinks the poison from a wine cup and then ends up dying, of course, shortly thereafter, the same way that Joffrey ends up dying. Exactly the same. It's written exactly the same. So this is one of those tinfoils I really genuinely do not like as a theory. I understand that a lot of people are looking for mysteries in this series, but I don't.
This is not one of them.
It's like it's already been solved. Like you're finding a mystery where there's none that actually exists. This has been solved. Yeah. This has been explicitly defined in the text itself.
We have why else is the scene there where Olenna and Marjorie talk to Sansa about Joffrey and get her to admit that he's a monster, and then they give this significant look to each other. Why is that there? The problem with a lot of these theories is they focus on one chapter, one scene, one little italicized passage in isolation on Reddit, and they don't take into account the entirety of the story and the dozen scenes that now make no sense because of your theory. So I think you need to look at these things a little more holistically, I think. But that's just me. Seslevi.
Seslevi, as the Americans say. Guilty Undertaker asked a really interesting question. He asked, do you think that Dany will be the queen who came too late when she gets to Westeros, similar to Quentyn was the prince who came too late to Meereen? I think that's a fascinating and really good parallel, actually.
Yeah, I think that's good. Dany's going to show up too late, I think, in terms of young Griff getting there first ahead of her in a lot of ways. And yeah, I think I like that idea that maybe we're looking at Quentyn's stories like a microcosm of Dany's, like West coming to East and then East coming to West. I like that.
I like it too. I think the idea for Daenerys Targaryen is that she has had this amazing arc in the first 5 books, and where she has gone from being essentially a slave to being the queen of Meereen, to having a large army, to having 3 dragons, to having this connection to the magical side. And then I love this idea that George has had in the narrative, at least since writing A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, that there would be someone who would come ahead of her and take all of the credit for all of the work that she's done. That person, of course, being young Griff, Aegon Targaryen. Not really, but Aegon Blackfyre. Anyways, it's really, I think it's really good on George's part that he has this part of the narrative, because I think as we can see it right now, it can be really too easy. It could be that Daenerys just kind of bulldozes everyone in Westeros and comes back and takes her throne and assumes her reign as the rightful queen rather of Westeros without any real consequences. And I think the consequences of her coming and being seen and viewed as someone who is a foreign invader, as someone who is bringing an army of former slaves, Ironborn, sellswords, people who are regularly disliked in Westeros, is a very good narrative touch on George's part. And I think it's going to help us to contextualize Dany's path and journey to get to Westeros in a much more, in a better fashion than the original pitch letter, which seemingly had Daenerys Targaryen gathering up the Dothraki and then invading Westeros.
Very well said. I completely agree.
All right.
Take a few more.
Yeah. Take some. Someone says Lemore. I don't know if they're asking if Lemore is.
I think that's Lemore is a Shara theory, right? Yeah, I'm not hugely into that one, no.
Who do you think Lemore is? Do you think, because she has some sort of assumed identity?
Right.
Do you care?
Not especially. I mean, I think she could be like Tyenne's mom. She's supposed to be a Scepter, right? Yeah. That's a possibility. Yeah, I think the more important thing is, she's someone who had a life that she was supposed to live and it didn't go as she expected it to. And that's the entirety of Young Griff's team. That's John Connington. That's Duck, who's in exile. Halden Halfmaester. That name says it all. Why is he only a Halfmaester? Well, something went wrong. That's why I didn't finish his chain. Everyone on Young Griff's team is like that because that's who Young Griff is. This kind of half-complete story archetype who's just being thrown into the plot. So there's clearly something going on there, but I'm not sure how significant it really is.
Yeah.
Oh, people are bringing up that she's the White Fawn. Went to the White Fawn, that one outlaw in the Kingswood Brotherhood. Yeah, that's also a solid theory, I think.
Are you ready for my tinfoil about?
Oh, who is it? Yeah.
It's Sarah Mopatis, my friend. The second wife of Illyrio.
Right. That she's not actually dead, and she does care for young Griff. She talks about that. She's I could definitely see that too.
Yeah. So I mean, I wrote about it a long time ago.
Yes, right. I remember that. Now.
It's one of those things I'm like you. I don't actually care a lot about unless people disagree with me. Then I care a lot about if people disagree with me. You know what I mean? Yeah. Then suddenly, and our friend Bernie brings up about why the stretch marks. Well, because she's gave birth to young Griff. That's why.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, that's solid.
All right, Big Mac asks, and he asked this a couple times, so we apologize for just getting to this question now. He asks, if A Song of Ice and Fire were to be readapted faithfully, do you think it could work in animation? If yes, does that mean that with age-appropriate characters, there should be no sex and no nudity?
Well, I mean, that depends what network it's on, what the rating is. But yeah, I mean, I would love A Song of Ice and Fire in animation. I think that's what really frees you up to do a lot of things with magic and battles visually that you can never do in a live action show. Obviously, I love so many of the actors that they got to play the people in Game of Thrones. I've just replaced the characters visually in my head. But the freer reign of animation, if you had really talented people working on it, I think could do wonders. But there's plenty of adult animation out there, as explicit as you want to be, although that that limits your audiences in some ways and gains it in others.
Yeah, I do think that the issue of the age-appropriate side is going to be a factor, regardless. I don't know how the laws work or how good taste would work in that setting, but I do think they may end up aging the characters back up again, similar to how Game of Thrones did with characters like Daenerys Targaryen, because of her first sex scene in season 1. Instead of her being 13 years old with Khal Drogo, she is, I believe, they age her up to 17 or 18 years old, whatever was the legal age of consent in the UK where they filmed it. So, I mean, I think that's may factor in as well for any animated version of A Song of Ice and Fire that we can see down the road. I'll take 2 more questions, you think?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
All right, I found there was one back here. Joe Schmo asks, what role is Marwyn the Mage going to play?
Whatever he wants.
Exactly. If you go back to our episode on Tyrion 6, right? It's the one. Yeah. We have a whole discussion about Marwyn the Mage and at the end of the Tyrion 6 and what we think his role is going to be, especially how Tyrion is going to interact with Marwyn the Mage, likely considering looking back to Sir Alistair Thorne and his relationship to that he had there and that interaction they had back in Tyrion's 6th chapter in A Clash of Kings. So broadly speaking, I think we can say that Marwyn is going to arrive at Dany's court. He's going to bring word of the others to Dany. He's going to be the first person to bring word of the others to Dany. And Dany is going to also be confronted with Tyrion, who's also going to be the first one to bring word to her about young Griff and about someone going ahead of her to take her throne, her rightful throne, the one we were talking about a little bit before. So he is going to be an antagonist to Tyrion, we suspect, in the Winds of Winter. And that's going to be interesting, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think you said it. It says they represent those paths for Dany. What's your priority? What are you going to do when you get to Westeros? Marwyn is there to bring news of the others. Tyrion is there to bring word of young Griff, and they'll have this debate. And Marwyn just knows a lot about magic and the backstory and the institutions of Westeros, so he'll be a useful figure for Daenerys in that regard. We got one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, take it away.
We got one from Rima William Yu. If Euron sacrifices the Ironborn, what army is he going to have? Well, what is it the Ironborn like to say? What is dead may never die, but rises again, harder and stronger. So I think he will have the same army, just a little more worse for wear on the other side of death. We will walk into the water and out of it again, as Patchface says. So
you think that Euron is like the Saruman figure in the Song of Ice and Fire? Is that like kind of
basically? Yeah, I think structurally speaking, the secondary villain with pretensions to being the major villain, who you don't spend much time directly seeing Sauron or the others. So you need like a kind of a human who's like more recognizable, and it's like, oh, I can see how a person could end up that way. Whereas Sauron and the others are just kind of like beyond humanity. You need like a human figure who's wrapped up at that scale of villainy. And in the same way that like Saruman is geographically useful as like a threat for people who aren't directly next to Mordor, same thing for Euron. He is a threat for people who are not directly next to the others.
I could definitely see that. I like the idea of him being the Saruman like figure as well as potentially being a dragon rider too. Maybe being the Night King figure in the story if we want to borrow from the Song of Ice and Fire's own lore. So we'll see what happens come next week, the week after that. Have we used that joke recently? I don't remember.
Within the recent week, got to make it every week in case it comes out the next week, at least once.
Someday it's actually going to be true. I really and truly believe that. I absolutely do. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much again for sticking around, folks. We love these live casts and hanging out with you afterwards, and we'll keep it going every month.
Absolutely. So you guys can probably guess that next month is going to be one of the Catelyn episodes. Is going to be our next live stream episode for the month of April. So we'll figure it out. Maybe we'll have another. We actually have another debate about coming up at some point for Catelyn, right? About whether Stannis. Well, go. I'm not going to. Maybe I shouldn't spoil.
I think we might want to do like whether Stannis ordered Renly killed in the Davos episode, because that's where a lot of the evidence for that is. I think with Catelyn, we might want to argue whether Renly's death is justified at all, regardless of whether Stannis was involved. Because I think you think it's 110% justified, and I think it's like 90% justified. So clearly, that's a
huge debate we're going to have there. Yeah,
you're like hell yeah, and I'm like yeah, but haha, but unless. So that'll be delightful.
Absolutely. So thank you guys so much for watching this episode. We really, really do appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy schedules to come watch us chat about these two chapters that were published in 1998, 22 years ago. So it means a lot to us, and hope you guys are enjoying these. And if you guys are patrons and you've not voted on what Patreon episode you want us to do, again, head on over to patreon.com/NotAcastASOF or become a patron at any level, and you can come vote on what episode you like us to see, as well as to get our 26 other episodes and Fever Dream episodes and all the other good stuff that we have there for all of our patrons. So I think that about wraps up. Thanks for listening. We'll see you guys very, very soon. Next month, at least. Bye.